The Spartan king who faced an empire. There is something strangely quiet about the story of Leonidas. Perhaps it is because we already know how it ends. We know that somewhere in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small group of Greek warriors will stand against an army so enormous that later generations would turn the encounter into legend. We know that their king will die. We know that the men around him will die. We know that the Persian army will eventually pass through the mountains and continue south. And yet, knowing the ending does not make the beginning feel any less human. Because before Leonidas became the marble statue, before the red cloak became an emblem, before the number 300 became almost a magical figure, there was simply a man, a Spartan king, a husband, a brother, a soldier who had grown old enough to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but the strange decision to move forward while fear was still sitting quietly inside your chest. So tonight, as the world outside becomes quieter, let us travel backward more than 24 centuries. Imagine Greece before the famous battle. There are no modern roads, no electric lights, no distant glow of cities illuminating the horizon. Only mountains, dark forests, cold streams, stone houses, olive trees moving softly in the night wind. And somewhere in the southern part of the Greek world, beneath the mountains of the Peloponnese, lies Sparta. Sparta is not a city that greets you warmly. It does not have the theatrical splendor of Athens, nor the monumental temples that would later become the postcard image of ancient Greece. Sparta is harder than that. Sparta is discipline. It is dust beneath sandals. It is the sound of boys being shouted awake before sunrise. It is meals eaten quickly. It is old men watching young men train. It is a society that has decided, perhaps more thoroughly than almost any other society in history, that the individual exists partly for the survival of the state. And, naturally, this philosophy had a few drawbacks. Because when you build an entire civilization around producing excellent soldiers, you eventually discover that excellent soldiers are rather difficult to convince to spend their lives doing anything else. The story of Leonidas begins inside this world. But to understand why he eventually stood at Thermopylae, we must first understand Sparta itself. And to understand Sparta, we must go even further back. We must begin with the land. The southern Greek peninsula is a landscape of contrasts. The sea is never particularly far away, but inland there are mountains rising sharply from valleys and plains. The soil can be stubborn. Rainfall is uneven. Travel is slow. Every valley has its own character, and every mountain range seems capable of dividing one community from another. Ancient Greece was never really one country in the modern sense. It was a collection of communities. Some were ruled by kings, some by aristocrats, some by councils, some by tyrants, some by assemblies, and some, like Sparta, developed political systems that seemed almost designed by someone who had been asked to make ordinary human life as complicated as possible. Sparta emerged in the region known as Laconia. Its territory eventually extended into neighboring Messenia, a fertile region west of Sparta. And that mattered enormously. Because Sparta did not simply conquer Messenia and then move on. The Spartans settled there. They controlled the land. And they forced much of the local population into a dependent agricultural class known as the Helots. The Helots worked the land. They grew grain. They tended crops. They produced food. And the Spartans were able to devote themselves increasingly to military training. This arrangement became the foundation of Spartan society. But it also created a permanent fear. The Spartans were a minority ruling over a much larger population. And the people they controlled had every reason to resent them. So Sparta developed a society that was permanently prepared for internal rebellion as well as external war. The Spartan citizen warrior was not merely a soldier who happened to live in a military society. He was a citizen whose entire social identity was connected to warfare. From childhood, boys were prepared for this role. Later writers described the Spartan educational system, known as the agoge, in remarkable detail. The intention was not to produce comfortable young men. Comfort was almost suspicious. Children were expected to become resilient. They learned obedience. They trained physically. They learned to endure hunger. They were taught to move in groups. They were expected to control themselves. Even speech was treated as something that should be disciplined. The famous Spartan reputation for brief, sharp replies probably comes partly from this culture. The word laconic itself comes from Laconia. A Spartan was supposed to speak when speaking served a purpose. A long explanation was suspicious. A short answer was better. If you could communicate your meaning in 5 words, why use 20? The ancient world, apparently, had already discovered the concept of not replying to a group chat. But beneath the stories and jokes was something serious. Sparta wanted men who could remain functional under pressure. And pressure was everywhere. The Spartan state feared rebellion. It feared rival Greek states. It feared the consequences of weakness. And eventually, it would have to face something much larger: Persia. But Leonidas was not born into the shadow of Thermopylae. He was born into the complicated royal family of Sparta. His exact birth date is unknown, but he was probably born around the middle of the 6th century BCE, perhaps around 540 BCE. This places his childhood in a world that would look astonishingly distant even to the Greeks who fought at Thermopylae decades later. The Persian Empire was rising. Athens was changing. Greek colonies stretched across the Mediterranean. And in the east, a new imperial power was assembling territories on a scale that the Greek city-states could scarcely imagine. Leonidas grew up as a member of the Aegead royal house. Sparta had an unusual system. It had 2 kings. 2 royal families ruled simultaneously, the Aegeads and the Eurypontids. This did not mean Sparta had twice as much wisdom. It mostly meant there were twice as many people capable of disagreeing with one another. The 2 kings had religious, military, and political responsibilities, but they were not absolute monarchs. Their authority existed alongside councils, magistrates, and the Spartan assembly. The kings were important, but they were not gods. And in Sparta, even kings were expected to obey the customs of the state. Leonidas was not originally expected to become the most famous of the Spartan kings. He was not the obvious heir. His older half-brother Cleomenes was ahead of him. Another brother, Dorius, was also a significant figure. Leonidas belonged to a family where succession could become complicated. And ancient royal families had a particular talent for turning family gatherings into political situations. Dorius, according to ancient accounts, was ambitious and believed he deserved greater status. He eventually left Sparta and attempted to establish a colony in North Africa. His story ended badly. His first attempt in Libya failed. He tried again in Sicily. There, he became involved in conflict and was killed. The world has many ways of reminding ambitious people that plans can go wrong. Dorius received one of the more permanent reminders. Leonidas, meanwhile, remained in Sparta. At some point, he married Gorgo, the daughter of his half-brother Cleomenes. This was not unusual among royal families of the ancient world. Political marriages were rarely simple matters of romance. They connected households. They strengthened alliances. They protected claims. They created obligations. And Gorgo herself would become one of the most memorable women associated with Spartan history. She was intelligent, politically aware, and unusually prominent in ancient accounts. But before she became remembered as the queen who stood beside Leonidas, she had already lived through the turbulent reign of her father. Cleomenes was a complicated man. He was capable. He was ambitious. He could be ruthless. And he was deeply involved in the politics of Greece. His reign helped establish Sparta as a major power outside the Peloponnese. Sparta had begun to intervene in the affairs of other Greek communities. It would support some regimes, oppose others. And slowly, the city acquired a reputation as the leading military power of mainland Greece. But while Sparta was becoming powerful, another power was becoming something else entirely: an empire. Far to the east, in the lands of modern Iran, the Persian king Cyrus had begun building a state that would eventually stretch across an astonishing portion of the known world. Cyrus the Great conquered the Median Empire. Then came Lydia. Then territories across the Near East. The Persian Empire expanded with remarkable speed. When Cyrus died, his successors continued the work. Cambyses conquered Egypt. Then came Darius. Darius I inherited an empire that already stretched over enormous distances. And Darius was not interested in merely maintaining it. He wanted order, revenue, Control. Recognition. The Persian Empire was a vast administrative machine. Different peoples could retain their customs and local traditions, but they were incorporated into the imperial system. Tributes flowed toward the center. Roads connected distant regions. Governors administered provinces. Messengers moved information across great distances. The empire was not simply a giant army. It was a system. And systems can be more frightening than armies. Because an army can be defeated, a system can keep producing another army. The Greeks first came directly into Persian attention through the Ionian Greek cities of western Anatolia. These communities had long existed under Persian control. In 499 BCE, the Ionian Revolt began. Several Greek cities rebelled against Persian authority. Athens and Eretria sent support. For Darius, this was not merely a distant provincial disturbance. It was an insult. The Persian king had been challenged. And worse, mainland Greeks had encouraged the challenge. Darius remembered. The revolt was eventually crushed. But the Persian king now had a reason to punish Athens and Eretria. And so, in 490 BCE, a Persian expedition crossed the Aegean. The Persian army landed at Marathon. Athens was threatened. The Athenians assembled their army, and Sparta was asked to help. But Sparta did not arrive in time for the battle. There were religious restrictions connected to the festival of Carnea. The Spartans could not immediately march. This was one of those moments when the Greeks discovered that even when an empire is invading, religious calendars remain inconveniently committed to themselves. The Athenians fought at Marathon without the full Spartan force, and they won. The Persian army withdrew. For a moment, the danger seemed to have passed, but it had not. Darius died before he could launch another invasion. His son inherited the throne. His name was Xerxes. And Xerxes would eventually attempt what his father had failed to accomplish. He would invade Greece on a scale far greater than the expedition at Marathon. For several years, preparations were made, and the Persian preparations were immense. Ships were assembled, supplies gathered, troops summoned from across the empire. The Persian king intended to march into Greece by land while his navy supported the advance. This was no raid. This was an invasion. And the Greeks knew it. In 480 BCE, Xerxes crossed into Europe. The scale of the Persian expedition has been debated for centuries. Ancient writers gave enormous numbers, sometimes hundreds of thousands, or even more than 1 million soldiers. Modern historians generally believe those figures are exaggerated, but the exact number is almost beside the point. The Persian force was enormous by the standards of the ancient Mediterranean. It included soldiers from many different peoples: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Lydians, Carians, and many others. They brought different weapons, different armor, different languages. They served one king. And behind them stood an empire that had already conquered lands from Central Asia to Egypt. The Greeks faced a problem. They were divided. Athens and Sparta were rivals. Many Greek cities had their own interests. Some were willing to resist Persia. Some were uncertain. Some were ready to submit. Some had already chosen the Persian side. The Greeks needed unity, which, historically, is a difficult thing to ask from Greeks. Eventually, a coalition formed. Athens would provide much of the naval strength. Sparta would provide leadership for the land forces. And the first major defensive position chosen was Thermopylae. The name means hot gates. It referred to the hot springs in the area. But the geographical importance of the location was more significant than its pleasant bathing opportunities. Thermopylae was a narrow coastal passage between steep mountains and the sea. An enormous army could not easily deploy there. Its numerical advantage would be reduced. And this was exactly what the Greeks needed. They could not defeat the Persian army in an open plain, but perhaps they could make it fight in a narrow corridor. The Persian army would be forced to approach in limited numbers. The Greek hoplites could use their heavy armor and long spears. The terrain could transform numbers into inconvenience. For once, geography was on the Greek side. And so, in the summer of 480 BCE, Leonidas was chosen to lead the Spartan contingent. He was probably around 60 years old. This matters. Popular imagination often portrays Leonidas as an eternally young warrior king, a bronze statue who wakes every morning looking as though he has just finished a particularly successful workout. The historical man was different. Leonidas was a mature king. He had lived through decades of Spartan politics. He had seen the rise of Persia. He had seen the previous Persian invasion. He understood that armies did not march simply because kings wanted them to. He knew the uncertainty of battle. He knew what defeat looked like. And he understood something else. The Spartan army could not simply march north with its full strength. The religious festival of Carnea was underway. Spartan military activity was restricted. The Olympic Games were also taking place. The Greeks, in other words, were preparing to confront the largest invasion they had ever seen, while simultaneously operating around a calendar of sacred festivals. It is almost impressive. The coalition nevertheless sent a small force toward Thermopylae. Leonidas brought approximately 300 Spartan citizens. These were not the only Greeks there. This point is important. The battle was not simply 300 Spartans versus the Persian Empire. Other Greek contingents fought at Thermopylae: Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, Locrians, and others. The number of Greek defenders changed over the course of the battle. The Spartans were simply the most famous, and among them were the 300. These men were not randomly selected teenagers. They were adult Spartan citizens. Many were experienced warriors. They were accompanied by helots who served the army in supporting roles. The Spartan force marched north. Imagine the journey. Dust rising beneath sandals, bronze armor catching the sun, leather creaking, wooden spear shafts knocking against shields. The men moving through the Greek landscape while villagers watched. Perhaps some wondered whether they would return. Perhaps others already understood that they probably would not. We often imagine ancient armies as anonymous masses. But every soldier had a home. Someone knew his name. Someone had shared food with him. Someone had heard his voice. Someone expected him to come back. History tends to forget that part. It remembers numbers. 300. 10,000. 100,000. But numbers do not march. People do. And Leonidas knew this. As the Spartan king moved toward Thermopylae, Xerxes was already advancing through northern Greece. The Persian army crossed the Hellespont using enormous bridges. Ancient sources describe the first bridge being destroyed by a storm, after which Xerxes supposedly became furious and ordered the sea punished. Whether every detail is accurate is another question. But the story captures the scale of Persian royal authority. The king was not accustomed to being told no. The Persian army continued south. Cities surrendered. Others resisted. The Greek defensive strategy depended on controlling two connected points: Thermopylae by land, Artemisium by sea. The idea was simple. If the Persian army could be slowed at the pass while the Persian navy was prevented from dominating the nearby waters, the Greek coalition might have time to gather more forces. Thermopylae therefore became a waiting game. Leonidas and his men reached the pass. The springs were there. The mountains rose around them. The sea lay nearby. The ancient path through the pass was narrow. The Greeks repaired an old defensive wall, and then they waited. This may be one of the least appreciated aspects of military history. Waiting. Not charging. Not shouting. Not clashing shields. Waiting. You wake. You eat. You check your equipment. You watch the horizon. You wonder how far away the enemy is. You sleep badly. You wake again. The sun rises. The enemy is still there. And somewhere beyond the mountains, thousands upon thousands of men are moving. Xerxes eventually reached the vicinity of Thermopylae. He could see the Greek position. He could see the small force waiting in the pass. And perhaps, from his perspective, it looked almost absurd. A handful of Greeks standing in the way of an empire. Xerxes reportedly waited several days. Perhaps he expected them to retreat. They did not. He may have believed that the Greeks were trapped. He may also have underestimated what the terrain could do. Eventually, Persian messengers were sent to demand that the Greeks surrender their weapons. The famous Spartan response has been preserved in Greek tradition. The Persian demand was essentially simple: lay down your arms. The Spartan response was equally simple: come and take them. The Greek phrase was molenlab, come and take them. It is one of those sentences that has survived because it is so short that even history could not manage to lose it. But beneath the famous words was a grim reality. The Spartans were not pretending they could defeat the Persian Empire. They were choosing where they would fight, and that distinction matters. Courage is sometimes less about believing you will win than deciding that some things are worth standing for even when you know the odds. The first Persian attacks began. The Persian soldiers advanced into the narrow pass. The Greeks waited. Then the Greek line moved. Bronze shields, long spears, heavy armor. The hoplites fought in formation. The shield was not simply personal protection. It protected the man beside you. This was one of the central ideas of Greek heavy infantry warfare. Your survival depended partly on the man next to you maintaining his position. If he ran, the formation opened. If the formation opened, everyone became vulnerable. So the Greeks pushed forward as a wall. The Persians attacked. And the narrow terrain worked exactly as the Greeks had hoped. Only limited numbers of Persian soldiers could engage at once. The Greek heavy infantry could strike them with long spears before the lighter-armed Persian troops could effectively respond. Persian soldiers fell. Others stepped forward. And then more came. Again. And again. The Greeks rotated exhausted men. They used the terrain. They withdrew in controlled movements, then counterattacked. The fighting was brutal. Not cinematic. Not clean. Bronze weapons struck flesh. Shields crashed together. Men stumbled over bodies. The air filled with dust, sweat, shouting, and the metallic smell of blood. And all around them were mountains. For 2 days, the Persian attacks failed to break the Greek position. The Persian army had discovered something deeply inconvenient. The small Greek force was exactly where it needed to be. Then came the betrayal. A Greek named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed the Persians to bypass the main Greek position. The path was known. It was not magic. It was simply a route through the mountains. The Persians could move around the Greek army. Once Leonidas learned what had happened, the situation changed. The Greeks were going to be surrounded. Now came the decision that made Thermopylae legendary. Leonidas ordered most of the Greek force to withdraw. The Spartans would remain. So would the Thespians. A contingent of Thebans also remained, although their circumstances are debated. Leonidas knew what staying meant. He was not waiting for reinforcements. He was not expecting a miraculous rescue. He was not hoping the Persian king would suddenly develop a fondness for Greek constitutional government. He understood. The position was lost. But a retreat could save the larger Greek army. The Persian advance could still be delayed, and the story of resistance could still matter. Perhaps most importantly, Leonidas believed that the Spartan law and tradition demanded something from him. The king had responsibilities. The Spartan warrior was expected to stand. And so the final morning arrived. The sun rose over Thermopylae. The mountains caught the first light. The Greeks prepared their weapons. There would be no easy return. No quiet march back to Sparta. No reunion. No evening meal at home. The men knew. And perhaps that knowledge made the final hours strangely calm. There is a temptation to imagine such moments filled entirely with heroic speeches. Ancient writers loved speeches. But real men waiting for death may have been quieter. Perhaps someone adjusted a sandal. Perhaps another checked his shield. Perhaps a soldier drank water. Perhaps someone thought about his children. Perhaps someone looked toward the mountains and wondered whether he would ever see them again. This is the part of Thermopylae that monuments cannot fully capture. The battle became a symbol, but the people inside the symbol were still human. When the Persian army approached, the Greeks moved forward. This time they did not remain entirely inside the narrowest part of the pass. They advanced farther into the open area, fighting with the knowledge that retreat was no longer necessary. The battle became chaotic. Spears broke. Swords were drawn. Men fought at close range. Leonidas was killed. The Greeks fought fiercely around his body. According to tradition, they recovered his body and carried it back through the fighting. The Persian forces eventually overwhelmed the defenders. The Spartans died. The Thespians died. Many of the defenders were killed. The Thebans were captured. The Persian army had won the pass. The road south was open. Thermopylae had fallen. And yet, strangely, this was not remembered as an ordinary Persian victory. It became something else. A story. The Greeks who died there had lost the battle, but their resistance became part of the moral memory of Greece. And perhaps that is why the story has survived for so long. Because history is not always kind enough to give us victories that feel meaningful. Sometimes it gives us defeats that become more powerful than victories. Thermopylae delayed the Persian army. It gave the Greek coalition time. The naval battle at Artemisium was fought around the same period. The Persian army continued south. Athens was evacuated. The city was eventually occupied and burned. The Persian king entered Athens. For a moment, it looked as though the Greek resistance might collapse. But the war was not over. The Greeks had withdrawn to the sea. The Athenian navy gathered at Salamis. And there, the geography that had helped the Greeks at Thermopylae would again become important. Narrow waters. Limited maneuvering room. A large Persian fleet. A smaller Greek fleet. The Persian fleet could not use its numerical advantage effectively. The Greeks attacked. The Persian navy suffered a major defeat. Xerxes eventually withdrew much of his force. The following year, the Persian army returned under Mardonius. The Greeks fought again. At Plataea, the Persian army was defeated. The invasion failed. Greece remained independent. And Leonidas, who had died before the outcome was known, became one of the central symbols of that resistance. But the story does not end at Thermopylae. In fact, perhaps the most interesting part begins after the famous battle. Because once a man dies, other people begin deciding what his death means. The Greeks remembered Leonidas. The Spartans honored him. The Thespians remembered their own dead. Monuments were raised. Inscriptions were carved. Stories circulated. And over centuries, the historical Leonidas slowly became something larger. A symbol of courage. A symbol of sacrifice. A symbol of resistance against overwhelming power. But there is another side to Sparta. The Sparta that produced Leonidas was not a society of pure heroic virtue. It was harsh. It depended upon the labor of the helots. It practiced severe social discipline. Its political system was deeply unequal. Its military culture demanded enormous sacrifice from ordinary citizens. The same society that produced men capable of standing at Thermopylae also produced a system that many modern people would find deeply disturbing. History is rarely clean. The past does not hand us heroes without shadows. Leonidas was a Spartan king. That means his story belongs to a society that was both remarkable and deeply troubling. And perhaps that complexity makes the story more interesting. Because if we turn Leonidas into nothing more than a perfect hero, we lose the historical man. The real Leonidas lived in a world where duty, violence, honor, slavery, religion, family, and politics were tangled together. He did not have the luxury of seeing history from the future. He could not know what we know. He could not know that his death would be remembered for 25 centuries. He could not know that people would one day carve his name into stone. He could not know that artists would paint him. Writers would praise him. Filmmakers would turn his final stand into spectacle. He could not know that the 300 would become almost a mythological phrase. To Leonidas, Thermopylae was not a movie. It was a place. It was hot. It was dusty. It smelled of sweat, leather, horse, bronze, and blood. His soldiers were tired. The Persian army was enormous. And the king knew that the decision before him was final. There is something quietly haunting about that. Because sometimes the most famous moments in history are not experienced as famous moments. They are experienced as ordinary mornings. A man wakes. He puts on his equipment. He eats something. He speaks to a friend. He looks at the sky. And then he walks toward the thing that will become the most important moment of his life. Leonidas did not know he was entering legend. He was simply doing what he believed a Spartan king should do. And perhaps that is why his story endured. Not because he won. He didn't. Not because 300 men defeated an empire. They didn't. The Persian army passed through Thermopylae. The Greek defenders were killed. Athens burned. The Persian invasion continued. The legend became larger precisely because the historical event was so human. 300 men could not stop an empire forever, but they could stand for a moment. They could hold a narrow road. They could choose how they met the inevitable. And sometimes, in the strange mathematics of memory, one moment of resistance can outlive an entire empire. The Persian Empire itself would eventually disappear. Xerxes would die. Sparta would decline. Athens would rise and fall. Alexander the Great would conquer the Persian Empire. Rome would dominate Greece. Rome would fall. Kingdoms would disappear. Languages would change. Religions would spread. Cities would be buried. Centuries would become millennia. And still, somewhere in the mountains of central Greece, the name Thermopylae would remain. The Hot Gates. A place where the world once narrowed to a road between stone and sea, and where a Spartan king decided to stay. So perhaps tonight, when we remember Leonidas, we should not imagine the perfect warrior from the beginning. We should imagine the older man, the king who had spent decades living beneath the expectations of his society, the husband of Gorgo, the member of a difficult royal family, the soldier who knew exactly what war could do, a man who probably had more ordinary days than extraordinary ones. He had eaten. He had walked. He had argued. He had listened. He had slept. He had watched people grow older. He had watched people die. And eventually, he stood at Thermopylae. The final night before the last battle must have been strange. The fires would have burned low. The Persian camp would have stretched somewhere beyond the darkness. There may have been distant movement. Voices. Animals. Metal. Wine through the mountains. And among the Greek defenders, men who knew they would not see another sunrise. Perhaps some slept. Perhaps some could not. Perhaps the exhausted simply surrendered to the darkness. And above them, the stars continued their quiet movement. The stars did not care about Sparta. They did not care about Persia. They did not know the name Leonidas. They had seen armies before. They had seen kings rise. They had seen kings disappear. They had watched cities become ruins. And they would watch the same happen again. There is something comforting in that perspective. The ancient world was filled with people who believed their struggles were enormous. And to them, they were. But history is very good at reminding us that even the greatest empire is temporary. The Persian Empire was enormous, but it was temporary. Sparta was powerful, but temporary. Leonidas was mortal, but the story remained. Perhaps that is the real lesson of Thermopylae. Not that 300 men can defeat an empire. They cannot. Not that courage guarantees victory. It does not. Not that every last stand is noble. Sometimes a last stand is simply a tragedy. The deeper lesson is quieter. Human beings have always searched for meaning in moments when control disappears, when the future closes, when survival is uncertain, when all that remains is the choice of how to face what comes next. Leonidas made his choice. The 300 made theirs. And after the battle, the world continued. The Persians marched south. The Greeks regrouped. Ships fought at Salamis. Armies fought at Plataea. The war ended. The empire survived for generations. But the men at Thermopylae became something different. They became memory. And memory has strange powers. It can preserve a person long after stone has worn away. It can turn a battlefield into a symbol. It can take a dead king and make him speak to people who were born 2,000 years after his death. Tonight, perhaps that is enough. Not to worship Leonidas. Not to romanticize Sparta. Not to pretend the ancient world was nobler than it really was. But simply to remember the human being inside the legend. A man standing in a mountain pass. A man looking at an army. A man who knew the odds. A man who understood that he was not going home. And still, he remained. The mountains were there. The sea was there. The wind moved through the pass. The bronze shields waited. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the Persian army approached. Leonidas tightened his grip. The night passed slowly. And then morning came. The same sun that had risen over Greece for thousands of years rose once again. It illuminated the mountains. It touched the sea. It fell upon bronze. And for a brief moment, before the shouting began, the world was quiet. Then history moved. And Leonidas walked into it, not as a myth, not as a statue, but as a man, a mortal man, who became immortal only because other people remembered him. And perhaps, as we leave Thermopylae behind, that is where we should leave him, not frozen in stone, but walking slowly through the morning light, his footsteps fading into the mountains, the empire moving forward, the world changing, and the story becoming quieter with every passing century. 2,400 years later, we are still here, still listening, still wondering, still looking backward into the darkness. And somewhere, in that distant landscape of mountains and sea, the memory of a Spartan king remains. The hot gates are quiet now. The armies are gone. The shields are gone. The shouting is gone. Only the wind remains. And perhaps, if you listen carefully enough, beneath all the centuries, you can almost hear the soft rhythm of sandals on the ancient road. Step. 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 Into the darkness. Into history. Into sleep. Before the hot gates. And so, before we leave the mountains entirely, it is worth slowing down. Because the story of Leonidas is often told as though he simply appeared at Thermopylae one morning, already carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. But men do not become legends in a single afternoon. They become themselves slowly. Through childhood. Through family. Through mistakes. Through the habits forced upon them by the society around them. And Leonidas was shaped by Sparta long before Persia ever came marching toward Greece. To understand the man at Thermopylae, we have to spend some quiet time inside the world that created him. Imagine Sparta in the years of Leonidas's childhood. The morning comes early. There is no alarm clock. There is no gentle transition from sleep to consciousness. There is simply the sound of someone calling you awake. A boy opens his eyes. The room is dark. The floor is cold. Outside, the air carries the smell of smoke and earth. Perhaps there is frost on the ground in winter. Perhaps the summer morning is already warm. He rises. He does not know that centuries later people will describe his society as one of the most intensely militarized cultures of the ancient world. To him, this is simply life. The Spartan boy belongs to a system known as the agoge. The word is often translated in ways that can make it sound rather more pleasant than it was. It was not a school in the modern sense. There were no comfortable classrooms, no neatly arranged desks, no teacher asking everyone to turn to page 47. The boys were trained. They were disciplined. They were expected to endure. They learned physical skills. They learned obedience. They learned songs and traditions. They learned how to function as members of a group. And gradually, they were taught one of Sparta's most important lessons. You were not entirely your own. Your body belonged partly to the community. Your courage belonged partly to the community. Your reputation belonged partly to your family. And your death, if it came in battle, belonged to Sparta. This is an extraordinary idea, and also a frightening one. Because once a society convinces its children that personal desires must always come second to collective duty, it can produce extraordinary discipline. But it can also produce extraordinary cruelty. Sparta did both. The boys were deliberately exposed to hardship. They were expected to tolerate hunger. They could be given limited food and encouraged to find ways to supplement it. Ancient accounts even describe punishments for being caught stealing rather than for stealing itself. The message was not simply do not steal. It was closer to, if you are going to break the rules, at least do it competently. Which, admittedly, is a rather unusual educational philosophy. But Sparta believed hardship produced resilience. A boy who learned to tolerate discomfort would become a man who could tolerate the battlefield. A boy who learned to remain quiet under pressure would become a soldier who could maintain formation. A boy who learned that the group mattered more than himself would become a hoplite who did not abandon the shield wall simply because things had become unpleasant. And things could become very unpleasant. The Spartan shield was heavy. The bronze helmet was hot. The armor restricted movement. The spear was long and awkward until mastered. Marching under the Greek sun was exhausting. Battle was worse. So Sparta trained its citizens to treat suffering as something that could be endured. Leonidas grew up within this system. He would have learned its expectations from an early age. But there was another thing he learned. He was royal. That meant his life was different from that of an ordinary Spartan boy. Not necessarily easier. In some ways, more dangerous. Royal families live under observation. Every marriage matters. Every friendship can become political. Every disagreement can become a threat. And Leonidas was surrounded by people whose ambitions could change the course of his life. His half-brother Cleomenes became king. His other half-brother Dorius was ambitious. Dorius reportedly believed he deserved greater recognition. He was, according to Herodotus, extremely confident in his own abilities. That confidence eventually led him away from Sparta. He attempted to establish a colony in North Africa. The first attempt failed. He returned to Sparta. Then he left again. This time he went towards Sicily. There he became involved in local conflicts. Eventually he was killed. His story is a reminder that ancient Mediterranean politics was never neatly divided into countries with fixed borders. Greek communities established colonies across the Mediterranean. They traded with Phoenicians. They fought Carthaginians. They interacted with Egyptians. They competed with one another. The sea connected them as much as it separated them. And beyond the Aegean, Persia was growing. The world was becoming larger. Sparta might have preferred to remain concerned with the Peloponnese. But geography does not always respect political preferences. Neither does history. Leonidas's family was therefore living through a period of transition. The old Greek world was still there, but something new was approaching. Persia. The Persian Empire was unlike any political entity most Greeks had ever experienced. To understand why Xerxes could later bring such a massive army toward Greece, imagine the distances involved. From the Persian heartlands, imperial power reached westward across Mesopotamia. It extended into Anatolia. It reached Egypt. It touched the edges of Central Asia. People from dozens of cultures lived under Persian rule. Their languages differed. Their clothes differed. Their gods differed. Their weapons differed. Yet tribute and authority flowed toward the Persian king. The empire did not require everyone to become Persian. It required them to recognize Persian power. That was enough. And for Darius, the Greek mainland became increasingly important. The Ionian Greek cities had rebelled. Athens had helped them. The Persians eventually crushed the revolt. But Darius did not forget the role of Athens. The expedition to Marathon in 490 BCE was partly an attempt to punish the Athenians. The Persian army landed on the plain near Marathon. The Athenians marched out. And against expectations, the Greeks won. The battle became famous. But from the Persian perspective, it was not the end of the story. Darius still wanted to subdue Greece. He began preparing another invasion. Then he died. His son Xerxes inherited the throne. And Xerxes inherited the problem. The new king was not content simply to continue his father's plans. He wanted a massive invasion. This time, the Persians would not merely send an expeditionary force across the Aegean. They would move by land. They would build roads. They would transport supplies. They would construct bridges. They would bring ships. The invasion would become a logistical undertaking of enormous scale. And perhaps that is one of the most fascinating things about ancient warfare. Before the soldiers fight, someone has to feed them. Thousands of men require enormous quantities of grain. Horses need fodder. Animals need water. Weapons need repair. Ships need timber. Camp followers need food. Roads must be maintained. Bridges must be built. The glamorous part of war is usually the clash. The less glamorous part is everything that has to happen before the clash. And Xerxes' preparations were extraordinary. The Persian army marched toward the Hellespont. 2 enormous bridges were constructed across the water. The engineers used ships as floating supports. Ropes and cables held the structure together. Then nature intervened. A storm destroyed the first attempt. The ancient accounts describe Xerxes reacting furiously. Whether every detail is historical is uncertain, but the basic fact remains. The bridge had to be rebuilt, and it was. Eventually, the Persian army crossed, one enormous column after another. Men, animals, supplies, chariots, equipment. The movement must have seemed endless. Imagine standing somewhere near the road as the army passed. You would hear it before you understood what you were seeing. Footsteps, wheels, animal noises, commands, metal, dust. Then the first soldiers, then more, and still more. The road would disappear beneath movement. For someone from a small Greek city-state, the experience must have been almost impossible to comprehend. The Greeks were used to armies composed of citizens from nearby communities. The Persian army was imperial. Its scale reflected the empire itself. And somewhere in that moving mass was Xerxes. The king did not march as an ordinary soldier. His position was surrounded by ceremony and authority. But eventually the army had to pass through the same landscapes as everyone else. Mountains, rivers, narrow roads, coastal plains. And this was where Greek geography became important. The Persian army was powerful, but geography does not care how powerful an army is. A mountain is still a mountain. A narrow pass is still narrow. A difficult road is still difficult. And the Greeks knew this. The coalition leaders looked for places where Persian numbers could be reduced. Thermopylae was ideal. But before the Greeks reached that point, there was the problem of unity. Athens and Sparta did not naturally trust one another. They had competed for influence. Their political systems were different. Their priorities were different. Athens was increasingly naval. Sparta was overwhelmingly land-focused. Athens had a growing population and expanding maritime interests. Sparta was built around its control of the Peloponnese. The two states had plenty of reasons to dislike one another. Yet Persia changed the calculation. A foreign empire was approaching, and suddenly Greek rivalry became a luxury. The Greeks formed a defensive alliance. Sparta was given leadership over the land forces. This was not because every Greek city adored Sparta. Far from it. Sparta had plenty of enemies, but the Spartans possessed a reputation for military discipline that few other Greek states could match. And so Leonidas became part of a much larger story. The question was no longer simply what happened to Sparta. It was whether the Greek mainland would remain politically independent. The Spartan kings were expected to lead armies. This was one of the major functions of the monarchy. But Leonidas faced an awkward problem. Sparta could not simply mobilize its entire army immediately. The Carnea festival was sacred. Military activity was restricted. The Olympic Games were also occurring. The ancient Greek world did not separate religion from politics in the way modern societies often do. Sacred traditions could influence military decisions. A king might genuinely believe that violating religious obligations would be dangerous. Modern readers may find this frustrating. Imagine an invading empire approaching and someone saying, "We should probably wait until the festival is over." But to the people involved, the gods were not abstract concepts. Religion was part of reality. The universe had order. The gods mattered. Omens mattered. Sacred customs mattered. And a king who violated them might be accused of endangering the entire community. So Leonidas was sent with a relatively small force. 300 Spartiates. A number that would become legendary. But behind the number were individual men. Men with families. Men with debts. Men with friendships. Men who had spent years training together. Men who had perhaps complained about their meals. Men who had argued. Men who had laughed. Men who had been injured. Men who had watched their children grow. The 300 were not 300 identical heroes. They were 300 separate lives. And the decision to send them was significant. They were the men expected to form the core of the Spartan royal guard. Their presence demonstrated that this was serious. Leonidas was not going north with a ceremonial escort. He was going with men who could fight and die. The march toward Thermopylae continued. As the Greek army moved north, rumors must have traveled ahead of them. The Persian army was enormous. Some towns had surrendered. Others had resisted. People were frightened. Some Greeks believed resistance was hopeless. Others believed the Persians could be stopped. There was no certainty. Only choices. And Leonidas was approaching one of the most important choices of his life. At Thermopylae, the landscape itself seemed to invite a confrontation. The mountains pressed close to the sea. The pass narrowed. Hot springs emerged from the earth. The road ran through a constricted corridor. The Greeks repaired the ancient wall. Then they settled in. The first days may have been strangely ordinary. Men ate. They slept. They cleaned their weapons. They talked. They watched the Persian camp. Some may have prayed. Some may have joked. Some may have been afraid. And perhaps, in the evening, the mountains became dark and silent. The Persian campfires would have stretched across the distance. Thousands of tiny points of light. The Greeks could see them. They knew what they represented. Every fire meant men. Every man represented another spear, another shield, another possible death. Yet the Greek line remained. Eventually Xerxes sent scouts. They studied the pass. They watched the defenders. The Persians needed information. How many Greeks? How strong was the position? Could the pass be forced? Could the defenders be frightened into retreat? Xerxes may have believed that the Greeks would surrender. Why would a small force deliberately stand in the path of an army so much larger? The Persian king may have assumed rational people would retreat. But courage often looks irrational from a safe distance. The Greeks were not necessarily convinced they would survive. They simply believed retreat would have consequences. If the Persians broke through Thermopylae, central Greece would be exposed. Athens would be threatened. The coalition could collapse. The Persian army would gain momentum. The Greeks needed time. And time was exactly what Thermopylae could provide. Then came the famous exchange. The Persians demanded that the Greeks surrender their weapons. The response attributed to Leonidas was brief. Come and take them. There are moments in history when a sentence becomes more famous than the people who spoke it. This was one of them. But perhaps the most interesting thing about the phrase is how practical it was. There was no complicated philosophy, no elaborate argument, no attempt to persuade Xerxes, just a refusal. The Persian king had asked for the weapons. Leonidas told him he would have to come and get them. And so the battle began. The first Persian troops moved forward. The Greeks waited. The distance between the armies closed. Then the Persian attack struck the Greek line. The noise must have been overwhelming. Shields crashing. Men shouting. Officers calling commands. Spears striking bronze. Feet sliding through dust. The smell of sweat. The sharp smell of blood. The Greeks held. The Persian soldiers came again. And again. The narrow pass made it difficult for the Persians to bring their full strength against the defenders. Only a limited number could fight at once. This was the entire point. The Greeks had turned geography into a weapon. A Persian soldier could not simply attack with the full weight of the empire. He had to approach through a narrow space. The Greek hoplite stood behind his shield. His body was protected. The man beside him protected his other side. Together, the formation became a moving wall. The Persians attacked. The Greeks pushed. The first day passed. The Persian army did not break through. Then came another attack. Still no breakthrough. The Persians used some of their elite troops. Among them were the famous immortals. The name is often misunderstood. They were not literally immortal. The unit was called the Immortals by Greek sources, perhaps because its strength was constantly maintained. When one man died or left the unit, another replaced him. The unit always appeared to have the same number. It created the impression of permanence, which is a rather clever military branding strategy. But even the Immortals struggled in the narrow pass. The Greek heavy infantry had the advantage of terrain. The Spartans were experienced. The Persian infantry could fight bravely. There is no reason to imagine otherwise. They were not cowards. They were soldiers serving an empire. But courage alone cannot solve a geographical problem. And so the battle continued. The second day. More attacks. More dead. The Greeks remained. Then, sometime after the fighting began, a man named Ephialtes approached the Persians. He knew of a mountain path, a route that could lead around the Greek position. For the Persians, this was exactly the information they needed. The narrow pass could be bypassed. The Greek defensive strategy depended upon controlling the route. Now the route had been compromised. The Persians moved at night. The mountain path was difficult. The men had to climb. The darkness concealed movement. The Greeks guarding the path were caught by surprise. When dawn came, Leonidas knew. The Persian army was going to surround them. The battle was no longer simply a matter of holding the pass. The Greek position had become a trap. This was the moment when Leonidas had to decide what to do. He could attempt to retreat. He could order everyone to withdraw. He could try to fight his way south. Or he could stay. Ancient sources differ in the details surrounding his decision, but the broad outline is clear. Most of the Greek force withdrew. Leonidas remained with the Spartans and the Thespians. The Thespians also remained, though their role is interpreted differently by ancient and modern historians. The decision was not necessarily a desire for glorious death. There was strategy involved. A small force could remain and delay the Persian advance. The larger Greek army could escape. The naval forces could continue fighting. The resistance could reorganize. Leonidas's sacrifice could buy time. And time was precious. The final battle began. The Greeks advanced. They fought with extraordinary determination. They knew the enemy was approaching from multiple directions. They knew there was no rescue. They knew the pass was lost. And yet they fought. Leonidas fell. The Greeks fought around his body. The struggle became desperate. The ancient accounts describe repeated attempts by the Greeks to recover the king's body. Eventually, the Persians secured the battlefield. The defenders were overwhelmed. Thermopylae was open. The road south was clear. The Persian army moved forward. And the Greeks, despite losing the pass, had accomplished something important. They had bought time. The story of Thermopylae, therefore, has two endings. One is military. The Persians won. The other is cultural. The Greeks remembered. And cultural victories can last far longer than military ones. Leonidas became an example. The 300 became a number that represented resistance. But the Thespians deserve to be remembered as well. Around 700 Thespians stayed. They were not simply background figures in the story. They knowingly remained in a battle they were unlikely to survive. Their sacrifice became part of the memory of Thermopylae. The famous story is therefore not really about 300 men. It is about a larger group of Greeks who decided, for different reasons, to remain. But history loves simple numbers. 300 is memorable. 300 sounds complete. It is easy to repeat. And eventually the 300 became the title of the story. Yet behind them were hundreds of other lives. That is something worth remembering whenever history becomes too neat. The ancient world was messy. The battle was messy. The motives were complicated. The numbers are uncertain. The speeches were probably reconstructed. And the surviving accounts were written after the events. The historian Herodotus wrote the most famous surviving narrative. He lived in the 5th century BCE, not long after the Persian Wars. His work is invaluable, but it is also filled with stories, speeches, rumors, traditions, and details that historians must examine carefully. Herodotus himself sometimes signals uncertainty. He tells us what he has heard. He compares different accounts. He occasionally admits that he does not know which version is correct. This is one reason his work remains so fascinating. He is not simply handing us a perfect recording of the past. He is showing us the process of remembering it. And memory had already begun transforming Thermopylae. The battlefield became sacred. The dead were honored. Inscriptions were placed. One of the most famous traditions concerns a memorial inscription associated with the Spartan dead. It conveyed the idea that the Spartans had died obeying their laws. That idea became central to the meaning of Thermopylae. The men did not die because they expected victory. They died because they believed duty required them to remain. That concept shaped later interpretations. And eventually, Leonidas became more than a historical king. He became a symbol of disciplined resistance. But there is something else worth noticing. Leonidas did not create Spartan culture. He inherited it. The expectation that a Spartan should stand and fight was older than him. The willingness to die rather than retreat had been built into the society. The king was expected to embody those values. In that sense, Thermopylae was not an isolated act of individual heroism. It was the culmination of generations of social conditioning. The Spartan state had spent decades teaching men that the greatest shame was abandoning their place in the line. Now that lesson had reached its most famous test. And the cost was enormous. After Thermopylae, the Persian army moved south. Athens was evacuated. The Athenians had understood that they could not defend the city against the full Persian force. They withdrew by sea. The Persian army entered Athens. The city was burned. Temples were destroyed. Homes were abandoned. The Acropolis became a battlefield and then a ruin. Imagine the emotional impact. Athens had expected resistance. Instead, its people watched their city disappear behind them. Smoke rising into the sky. Stone buildings burning. Sacred places damaged. Families scattered. And yet the war was not over. The Greek fleet waited at Salamis. This was the next great test. The Persian army was powerful on land. But the sea was different. And Athens had invested heavily in ships. Themistocles, the Athenian statesman, had argued for naval strength. The decision proved crucial. At Salamis, the Greek fleet drew the Persian navy into confined waters. The Persian numerical advantage became difficult to use. Ships collided. Oars broke. Men fell into the water. The narrow straits became chaotic. And the Greeks won. Xerxes watched from the shore. The great invasion had begun to unravel. The Persian king eventually withdrew. But part of the Persian army remained in Greece under Mardonius. The next year, the final major land battle of the invasion took place at Plataea. There the Greeks defeated the Persian forces. The invasion failed. Greece remained outside Persian imperial control, and the death of Leonidas gained a new meaning. He had not stopped the Persian army, but the Greek resistance had survived. Thermopylae had become part of a chain of events. A delay. A naval battle. A final land battle. Together, they preserved Greek independence. Of course, Greek independence itself was not eternal. Nothing is. Sparta and Athens would later fight one another. The Peloponnesian War would devastate the Greek world. Sparta would eventually defeat Athens. Then Sparta's own power would decline. Macedon would rise. Alexander would conquer Persia. The Greek city-states would lose their independence. Rome would arrive. And eventually the Roman world would absorb Greece. But none of that had happened yet. At Thermopylae, the future was still hidden. Leonidas did not know that Athens would later fight Sparta. He did not know that Sparta would eventually lose its dominance. He did not know that Alexander would one day destroy the Persian Empire. He did not know that Greek culture would spread across Asia. He did not know that Rome would conquer the Mediterranean. He knew only the world immediately in front of him. A pass. An army. A duty. And a decision. Perhaps that is why the story feels so intimate despite its enormous scale. We often experience history backward. We know what happens. The people living through it did not. For Leonidas, there was no guarantee that Greece would survive. There was no certainty that the Persian invasion would fail. There was no promise that his sacrifice would be remembered. He could have died believing that the Persian Empire would simply roll south and conquer everything. And yet he stayed. That uncertainty is essential to courage. If you know the ending, bravery becomes easier to imagine. If you know you will eventually win, standing your ground is not the same thing. Leonidas did not know. He walked into uncertainty, and then he disappeared from history as a living man. The empire continued. The war continued. But Leonidas did not. His final moments are unknown. We do not know his exact words. We do not know what he thought immediately before he died. We do not know whether he was afraid. And perhaps we should leave that uncertainty intact. Because courage does not require fearlessness. A courageous person can be afraid. In fact, without fear, courage would hardly mean anything. The ancient world understood this differently from us. Honor mattered. Reputation mattered. Duty mattered. But fear was still real. The Spartan soldier was not a machine. He was flesh. He could bleed. He could panic. He could miss his family. He could want to live. And yet he could remain. That is what makes the story human. So when you picture Thermopylae tonight, do not imagine only the shouting. Imagine the silence before it. Imagine the cold stone beneath tired feet. Imagine the faint smoke rising from cooking fires. Imagine the men sitting quietly with their shields beside them. Imagine the sea moving somewhere beyond the pass. Imagine the mountains becoming black against the night sky. And imagine Leonidas looking outward. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he understood that the story was ending. Or perhaps he simply looked at the road and waited for morning. The answer is lost. The morning came anyway. And the Persian army came with it. The shields were lifted. The spears were ready. And the last stand began. Then, slowly, the noise disappeared. The men disappeared. The armies disappeared. The empire disappeared. Only the story remained. And now, more than 2,000 years later, we are still telling it. Not because the 300 were invincible. They were not. Not because Leonidas defeated Xerxes. He did not. But because for one brief moment, in one narrow place between mountains and sea, a small group of human beings decided that the size of the force coming toward them would not determine the meaning of their choice. The empire could take the pass. It could take the road. It could take the city. But it could not completely control how the story would be remembered. And perhaps that is the quietest victory of all. Because empires measure success in territory. People measure it in memory. And memory is much harder to conquer. So let the mountains grow quiet again. Let the Persian campfires disappear into the darkness. Let the shields rest. Let the old road become empty. The hot gates are quiet. The soldiers are gone. The kings are gone. The empire is gone. But the wind still moves through the mountains. And somewhere beneath that wind is a story about a man who knew he could not win the battle and still chose to stand. A story about 300. A story about hundreds more whose names are less familiar. A story about Greece. A story about Persia. A story about duty, fear, pride, sacrifice, and memory. And, perhaps most of all, a story about how very temporary even the greatest powers can be. Tonight, the empire is silent. Sparta is silent. Leonidas is silent. Only the story remains. And for now, that is enough. Enough to close our eyes. Enough to let the centuries become distant. Enough to hear the sea beyond the mountains. Enough to imagine the old road fading beneath the moonlight. And enough to remember that once, long ago, a king stood at the hot gates. Then the darkness came. And history carried him away. Sparta after Leonidas. For a moment, let us remain at Thermopylae. Not because the battle is still happening. It is over. The Persian army has moved on. The Greek dead remain. The road is open. The mountains are quiet again. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about ancient battlefields. After the shouting stops, the landscape does not know that anything important has happened. The same wind continues to move through the grass. Birds return. Water continues to flow from the springs. The sea continues to wash against the shore. The mountains remain exactly where they were. Only human beings have changed. The dead are carried away. The living move south. And somewhere in the Persian camp, officers are already discussing the next stage of the invasion. Because history is remarkably indifferent to our emotional need for a dramatic pause. Xerxes cannot simply stop and contemplate the poetry of the moment. He has an empire to manage, an army to feed, a campaign to finish. The Persian army moves forward, but the story of Leonidas is beginning to move in another direction, toward memory, toward legend, toward Sparta. Back in the Peloponnese, the news eventually arrives. Leonidas is dead. The 300 are dead. The Thespians are dead. Thermopylae has fallen. For the Spartan community, this is not merely news of a military defeat. Their king is gone. And Leonidas was not just any soldier. He was a member of the Aegead royal house. He had led the army personally. He had died in the place where Spartan tradition demanded that a king should be willing to die. His death therefore carried enormous symbolic weight. But there would have been something more immediate. A quieter, more personal kind of grief. Families would learn that husbands had not returned. Children would learn that fathers were gone. Mothers would hear the names of the dead. Wives would wait for news that could not become good news. Sparta had built a society around military excellence. But every military society eventually discovers the price of its own ideals. The shield that protects a soldier can also become the object carried home over his body. The spear that makes him powerful can become the weapon beside which he is remembered. The battlefield creates heroes. It also creates widows. Ancient societies knew this intimately. We sometimes imagine Sparta as a place where people were trained to suppress emotion. That is an oversimplification. The Spartans valued endurance. But endurance does not mean the absence of grief. It means carrying grief without allowing it to destroy your responsibilities. That was the ideal. And Leonidas's death would become part of that ideal. There was a practical question now. Who would replace him? Spartan kingship did not simply disappear when a king died. The Agiad line continued. Leonidas had no surviving adult son who could immediately succeed him. His young son, Pleistarchus, inherited the kingship. But because he was a child, someone else had to govern in practice. That role eventually fell to Leonidas's half-brother Cleombrotus and later to Pausanias, who served as regent for Pleistarchus. This is an important detail because it reminds us that Leonidas's death did not end his family story. His son remained. The royal house remained. Sparta remained. And the political world continued. Pleistarchus would eventually become king in his own right. But by then, the world Leonidas had known was already changing. The Persian invasion had failed. Greek confidence increased. Athens became more powerful. Sparta remained dominant on land. The balance between the Greek states became increasingly complicated. The victory over Persia did not create permanent unity. In fact, it created new rivalries. Athens developed the Delian League. It became a maritime power of enormous importance. Sparta and its allies remained dominant in the Peloponnese. At first, cooperation between the two powers was possible. But over time, suspicion grew. Athens was becoming too powerful. Sparta watched. Athens watched Sparta. The same Greek world that had briefly united against Persia began to divide again. Because apparently, defeating an empire was not enough to make everyone suddenly become best friends. Human nature remained stubbornly human. And so the 5th century BCE continued. The Persian Wars became history. Leonidas became memory. The younger generation grew up hearing stories about the battle. Perhaps old soldiers told them what they had seen. Perhaps poets sang of Thermopylae. Perhaps families repeated stories about relatives who had died. And slowly, the battle became part of Greek identity. But memory has a tendency to simplify. The complicated man becomes the perfect hero. The uncertain battle becomes the glorious last stand. The many defenders become 300. The political circumstances become a story about courage against tyranny. And this is where historians have to slow down. Because the ancient Greeks themselves were already shaping the meaning of Thermopylae. They were not neutral observers. They were participants. They had political reasons to remember the battle in certain ways. The Spartans had every reason to emphasize the courage of their king. The Athenians had reasons to emphasize their own naval victory at Salamis. The Thespians had reasons to preserve the memory of their own sacrifice. Different communities remembered the same or differently. This is not a flaw in history. It is history. People remember the past according to what matters to them. And the story of Leonidas mattered enormously. The Spartans eventually established monuments at Thermopylae. The place became associated with sacrifice. Travelers could see the memorials. The dead had been transformed into examples. But there was another important development. The Persian Wars became part of Greek literature. Writers began to reflect on what had happened. Herodotus wrote his histories. He collected stories. He interviewed people. He traveled. He preserved traditions. And in his account, Leonidas emerges as one of the most important figures of the campaign. Herodotus describes the king as a man who understood the danger. He presents the Spartans as committed to their laws. He tells stories about the final battle. Some of these stories may be historically accurate. Others may reflect later storytelling. But together they created the version of Thermopylae that would survive. There is a famous story concerning the Spartan attitude toward Persian arrows. The Persians were said to have so many archers that their arrows would darken the sun. A Spartan soldier supposedly responded that fighting in the shade would be convenient. It is a wonderful line. Perhaps it was said. Perhaps it was not. But whether historically precise or not, it captures the image Sparta wanted to project. Fearless. Dry. Unimpressed. Almost irritatingly calm. And perhaps there is some truth behind the legend. People who train for years to remain calm under pressure may genuinely develop a different relationship with danger. The Spartans did not believe fear could be eliminated. They believed it could be controlled. This is an important distinction. A soldier who feels no fear may be reckless. A soldier who feels fear and acts despite it can be disciplined. Sparta wanted the second kind, and Leonidas embodied that ideal. But the historical Sparta behind the legend deserves closer attention. The Spartan economy depended heavily on the Helot population. These agricultural laborers worked land that supported the Spartan citizen class. Without them, the Spartan military system could not function as it did. This created a permanent contradiction. Sparta needed its citizens to train as soldiers. But those soldiers could not spend all their time farming. So someone else had to produce the food. The answer was the Helots. And because the Helots greatly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, the Spartans lived with constant anxiety about rebellion. This fear shaped their military culture. The army was not only an instrument for fighting foreign enemies. It was also a guarantee against internal revolt. The Spartan system was therefore built upon a paradox. It produced extraordinary military discipline partly because it was afraid of the people it ruled. This does not make Thermopylae meaningless. It makes it more complicated. The men who died there were courageous. The society that produced them was also deeply unequal. Both things can be true. History does not require us to choose between admiration and criticism. We can recognize courage without pretending the entire culture was virtuous. And perhaps that is a useful lesson when looking at ancient heroes. Heroes belong to their societies. They carry the values of their world. They also carry its contradictions. Leonidas was not a modern freedom fighter. He was a Spartan king. His world accepted slavery. It accepted extreme social hierarchy. It accepted violence as a normal instrument of politics. And yet, within that world, Leonidas made a decision that later generations would interpret as noble. The challenge is to hold those truths together. After the Persian Wars, Sparta's prestige increased. Its soldiers were feared. Its political system was admired by some Greeks and hated by others. Philosophers later discussed Sparta as an example of discipline. Athens became the great center of democracy, art, philosophy, and naval power. The contrast between the two cities became famous. Athens looked toward the sea, Sparta toward the land. Athens celebrated public debate. Sparta celebrated obedience. Athens built monuments. Sparta famously avoided excessive luxury. Athens produced philosophers. Sparta produced soldiers. But these contrasts can be exaggerated. Spartans were not incapable of thought. Athenians were not incapable of fighting. Both societies were complicated, and both depended upon labor from people who did not enjoy full political rights. The Greek world was never the simple birthplace of modern freedom that later generations sometimes imagined. It was a world of citizens and outsiders, masters and dependents, democracy and slavery, philosophy and war, beauty and cruelty, all existing side by side. And perhaps nowhere is this contradiction more visible than in the story of Leonidas. A man remembered for defending Greek freedom belonged to a society that denied freedom to many people under its control. That does not erase his courage, but it should make us thoughtful about the words we use. Because history becomes dangerous when we turn complicated human beings into simple symbols. Leonidas was a symbol, but he was also a man. And the more we look at the man, the more interesting the story becomes. His wife, Gorgo, is an important part of that story. She was the daughter of Cleomenes. She grew up within the Spartan royal family. Ancient writers remembered her as intelligent and politically aware. One famous story describes her warning her father about a message hidden inside a wooden tablet. Another account associates her with the famous statement that a Spartan woman could speak openly to men about political matters. Whether every anecdote is historically reliable is uncertain, but the survival of these stories tells us something. Gorgo had become part of the cultural memory of Sparta. She was not remembered merely as Leonidas's wife. She was remembered as someone capable of political judgment. And that matters because Sparta's women occupied a position that differed significantly from women in many other Greek societies. Spartan women could own and inherit property. They had greater economic independence. They received physical education. They could speak more openly in public. They had responsibilities within the household, while men spent long periods in military training. This did not make Sparta an egalitarian society. It simply meant its gender roles were different. And once again, the ancient world refuses to fit neatly into modern categories. Gorgo would have experienced Leonidas's death personally. She lost her husband. Her son became king. Her household became part of the royal succession. She lived in a world where political events were also family events. There was no separation. The death of a king was the death of a husband. The succession of a child was the future of a family. The survival of a city was the survival of a household. And perhaps this is something we lose when we speak only about armies. War happens to families. Leonidas went to Thermopylae, but his absence continued at home. His son grew up without him. Gorgo continued living in Sparta. The royal household continued. Life did not stop because one chapter had ended. There were meals, children, religious ceremonies, political meetings, harvests, funerals, births. The ordinary machinery of existence continued. And that is one of the most haunting things about historical tragedy. The world does not stop for grief. A person dies. The next morning arrives. Someone has to light the fire. Someone has to feed the animals. Someone has to prepare food. Someone has to make political decisions. Someone has to raise the children. The sun rises even when the person you loved will never see it again. The ancient Spartans understood this deeply. Their society expected people to continue. The dead were honored. But the living had duties. Leonidas's son Pleistarchus therefore grew up beneath an enormous inheritance. Imagine being told from childhood that your father was the king who died at Thermopylae. Imagine living in a society where every soldier knew the story. Imagine hearing his name spoken by older men. Imagine being expected to become worthy of him. It is a strange inheritance. A crown can be heavy, but a legend may be heavier. Pleistarchus did not create the legend. He inherited it. And so did Sparta. Over the following decades, the story of Thermopylae became increasingly important in Spartan identity. The battle represented the ideal citizen, the ideal king, the ideal soldier, the ideal sacrifice. But Sparta would soon face problems that no amount of heroic memory could solve. The city had powerful enemies. Athens was growing. The Hellenic population remained a constant concern. Economic inequalities existed among Spartan citizens. The number of full Spartan citizens declined over time. This was a serious problem. The Spartan military system depended upon a relatively small class of citizens who could devote themselves to training and warfare. But that class gradually became smaller. Land became concentrated. Some citizens lost the wealth necessary to maintain their status. And as the number of full citizens declined, the famous Spartan military machine became harder to sustain. This would matter later. Because the reputation of Sparta remained immense even as its underlying social structure became more fragile. There is a pattern here that appears throughout history. A society can become famous for the strength it possessed at one particular moment. Later generations inherit the reputation. But reputation is not the same thing as capacity. The Sparta that people imagined in later centuries was often the Sparta of Leonidas. The real Sparta was changing. And eventually, those changes would become impossible to ignore. The Peloponnesian War would test the Greek world. Athens and Sparta would become enemies. The alliance that had helped resist Persia would collapse. From 431 to 404 BCE, the Greek world fought a devastating conflict. Sparta eventually won, but victory came at enormous cost. Athens was weakened. Sparta became the dominant Greek power. For a brief period, it looked as though Sparta had inherited the position of leader of Greece. But the victory contained the seeds of decline. Sparta had defeated Athens. Now it had to govern a wider Greek world. That was more difficult. Military reputation could win battles. It could not automatically create stable political order. Other Greek states resisted Spartan dominance. Thebes rose. And in 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, the Spartan army suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Thebans. The old myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered. The Theban commander Epaminondas defeated the Spartans using innovative tactics. Spartan power collapsed rapidly. Messenia was liberated. The Hellenic population there was no longer under Spartan control. This was a devastating blow. The economic foundation of Sparta was weakened. The great military power of the 5th century was no longer dominant, and the memory of Leonidas now became even more interesting. Because the Sparta of Leonidas had become a historical golden age in the minds of later Spartans. They remembered the moment when their society appeared strongest, the moment when their king stood at Thermopylae, the moment when Sparta's name echoed across Greece. But the real city had changed. Time had done what armies could not. It had worn down the system. And this is perhaps one of the most beautiful ironies in the entire story. Leonidas became immortal. Sparta did not. The king remained in memory. The state itself slowly faded. The city continued to exist, of course, but its political importance declined. Macedon rose under Philip II, then Alexander. The Persian Empire that Leonidas had faced was eventually destroyed by Alexander's armies. Xerxes became a figure of the past. The empire that had once seemed almost limitless was conquered. Alexander's soldiers marched through Persia. They entered Babylon. They reached the eastern edges of the known world, and Greek culture traveled with them. The Greek world expanded beyond Greece itself. Persia changed. The Mediterranean changed. The ancient political order transformed. Leonidas could never have imagined any of it. If someone had told him, standing at Thermopylae, that one day a Macedonian king would march into Persia and destroy the empire of Xerxes, it would have sounded absurd. And yet it happened. History has a strange sense of humor. The empire that seemed unstoppable did not last forever. Neither did Sparta. Neither did Athens. Neither did Macedon. And yet the memory of their conflicts continued. The story of Leonidas became increasingly detached from the actual politics of Sparta. He was no longer simply a king. He was an archetype. The last stand. The warrior king. The man who refused to surrender. Later generations would repeatedly return to him. Roman writers mentioned the Spartans. European travelers visited the ruins of Sparta. Artists imagined Thermopylae. Poets wrote about Leonidas. And in the modern world, the story became even larger. Books, paintings, statues, films, comics, games. Every generation recreated Leonidas according to its own imagination. Sometimes he became a symbol of national resistance. Sometimes military discipline. Sometimes heroic sacrifice. Sometimes political freedom. Sometimes something else entirely. The historical Leonidas became a mirror. People looked at him and saw what they wanted to see. But beneath every interpretation remained the same basic event. A king stood at a narrow pass. His army was too small. The enemy was too large. The position was eventually betrayed. The defenders were surrounded. And they died. The simplicity of that story is almost impossible to resist. Yet perhaps the most important part is what happened before the battle. The years of preparation. The family. The society. The politics. The fear. The uncertainty. The ordinary life that existed before the extraordinary death. Because history is not really a collection of famous moments. It is the long stretch of ordinary time between them. Leonidas spent most of his life not at Thermopylae. Most of his life was probably mundane. He woke up. He ate. He trained. He governed. He attended ceremonies. He spoke with family. He dealt with political problems. He watched Sparta change. And then, near the end of his life, Persia came. That is how history usually works. The extraordinary arrives suddenly. The ordinary prepares us for it. And so perhaps the real story of Leonidas is not simply about the final battle. It is about everything that made that battle possible. A society obsessed with discipline. A king raised inside its traditions. An empire expanding westward. A Greek world divided by rivalry. A moment of temporary unity. A narrow mountain pass. A decision. And then death. The rest is memory. And memory is where Leonidas truly became immortal. Centuries after Thermopylae, the battlefield still carried the story. The inscriptions remained. Travelers came. They looked upon the place. They imagined the armies. They imagined the king. They imagined the final stand. And perhaps each generation added something. A little more courage. A little more certainty. a little more symbolism, a little more legend. Until eventually, the historical man disappeared behind the statue. So tonight, it is worth stepping behind that statue. Take away the helmet. Take away the famous pose. Take away the modern image of the perfect warrior. Take away the cinematic muscles. Take away the dramatic soundtrack. What remains? A man. A Spartan. A king. A husband. A father. A citizen. A soldier. Someone born into a complicated society and trained to serve it. Someone who eventually reached a moment when his choices became larger than his own life. And perhaps that is enough. The night settles over the Peloponnese. The hills around Sparta become dark. The Eurotas River moves quietly through the valley. The old city sleeps. There are no armies marching tonight. No Persian scouts. No bronze shields. No trumpets. No shouting. Only darkness. And if you could stand there, more than 2,000 years ago, perhaps you would hear the same things people have always heard at night. The wind. The insects. Water moving over stones. A distant animal. Someone speaking quietly inside a house. Then silence. Sparta was never truly silent, but it was quiet enough. And somewhere beneath that quiet, the memory of Leonidas remained. A king who had gone north. A king who had died. A king whose death had become a story. And stories, unlike kingdoms, do not always need armies to survive. They need only someone willing to remember. So the centuries continue to pass. Persia disappears. Sparta declines. Athens becomes ruins. The ancient world becomes archaeology. But the hot gates remain. The road becomes wider. The landscape changes. People forget the exact paths. The stones move. The names fade. Yet the story remains. And perhaps that is the final irony of Leonidas. He went to Thermopylae knowing that he would probably die. He could not have known that death would be the beginning of his longest life. Because his first life lasted perhaps 60 years. His second life, the life of memory, has lasted more than 2,000. And it is still going. Tonight, somewhere far from Greece, someone is hearing his name. Someone is imagining the mountains. Someone is picturing the shields. Someone is wondering what it would have felt like to stand there. And perhaps that is enough to keep the old king alive. Not in flesh. Not in bronze. But in imagination. The battlefield is empty now. The empire is gone. The soldiers are gone. The king is gone. But the wind continues to pass through the mountains. Slowly. Quietly. As it did before the battle. As it did after the battle. As it will continue long after we are gone. And if there is one thing the story of Leonidas teaches us, perhaps it is not simply that courage can survive death. It is that human beings are always trying to decide what their lives mean. Sometimes they find the answer in victory. Sometimes in love. Sometimes in duty. And sometimes, like Leonidas, in the way they choose to stand when there is nowhere left to go. The night deepens. The old roads disappear beneath darkness. The mountains become silhouettes. The sea becomes a black, quiet horizon. And the story of Sparta begins to fade into the larger story of Greece. But we are not finished yet. Because the legend of Leonidas would travel much farther than the battlefield. Across Rome. Across medieval Europe. Across the Renaissance. Across the modern world. And with every century, people would ask the same question. Why do we still remember the men who died at Thermopylae? Perhaps tomorrow, we will answer it. For tonight, let the question remain. Let it drift quietly into the darkness. Like the last sound of footsteps disappearing along an ancient road. Step. 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 And then silence. From history into legend. There is a peculiar moment in every historical story when the people who lived through it disappear and the people who remember them begin to take over. For Leonidas, that transformation happened slowly. At first, he was simply dead. His body had been fought over at Thermopylae. His family mourned him. His son inherited his throne. His fellow Spartans remembered him. The Persian invasion continued, and the world moved on. But after the immediate grief came remembrance. After remembrance came interpretation. And after interpretation came legend. This is where the Leonidas we know today began to emerge. The real man had been a Spartan king. The legendary man became something much larger. He became the king who refused to surrender, the warrior who understood the odds, the defender who stood against an empire, the symbol of courage in hopeless circumstances. And eventually, the story became so powerful that people began to forget how strange the original world actually was. So tonight, before we let the legend become too comfortable, let us return once more to ancient Greece. Not to the battlefield, to the years after it. Because the people who survived Thermopylae had to live with what happened. That is something stories about last stands often leave out. We remember the final morning. We rarely remember the morning after. The morning after Thermopylae, there were thousands of people who still had to make decisions. The Persian army had not vanished. Athens had not been saved. The Greek alliance had not yet won. The dead had to be counted. The living had to retreat. Messages had to be carried. Ships had to be moved. Families had to flee. Food had to be found. And the Greek leaders had to decide what to do next. This is the unromantic machinery of survival. Leonidas was gone. But the war continued. The Persian army moved through central Greece. The Greek position at Thermopylae had been broken. Athens was abandoned. The population evacuated towards safer locations, including the island of Salamis and other parts of the Greek world. The Persians entered Athens. The city burned. Temples were damaged. The Acropolis was occupied. The sight must have been devastating. Imagine the people of Athens watching their home disappear behind smoke. For a community that believed its city represented something extraordinary, the destruction was not simply physical. It was emotional, political, religious. The city had survived internal conflicts. It had survived earlier wars. But now a foreign army stood inside it. And yet the Athenians had made a calculated choice. They had abandoned the city to preserve the people and the fleet. A city can be rebuilt. A population cannot be replaced so easily. The Greek resistance therefore moved toward the sea. At Salamis, the future of the war would be decided. Themistocles understood something that Leonidas had understood at Thermopylae. Numbers were not everything. Terrain mattered. At Thermopylae, the terrain had narrowed the Persian army. At Salamis, the narrow waters would constrain the Persian fleet. The Persian navy was larger. But larger fleets were not necessarily easier to control. Ships required space. They needed room to turn. They needed coordination. In narrow waters, a huge fleet could become its own obstacle. And so the Greeks waited. The Persian fleet entered the straits. The battle began. From the shore, Xerxes could observe. The king expected victory. The Persian fleet advanced. Then the Greek ships attacked. The waters became chaotic, or shattered. Ships collided. Men fell into the sea. The sound must have been extraordinary. Wood striking wood. Commands shouted over waves. Metal weapons clanging. Water rushing through damaged hulls. Smoke. Sweat. Blood. The Persian fleet was defeated. The invasion had suffered a major setback. Xerxes now faced a difficult decision. His army was still in Greece. But the supply situation was becoming more difficult. His fleet had suffered serious losses. The king could not risk being trapped far from the imperial heartland. He withdrew much of his force. Mardonius remained with a large army. The war continued. And eventually, at Plataea, the Greek coalition achieved a decisive victory. The Persian invasion failed. The Greeks had survived. Leonidas had not. But the world he had died defending remained. And that mattered. In the years after the war, the Greeks began constructing their understanding of what had happened. Victory creates memory. Defeat creates memory too. But a sacrifice in a losing battle can become especially powerful when the eventual war is won. Thermopylae could be remembered as the moment when Greece refused to collapse. It was not the victory. It was the proof that resistance had begun. And this is why Leonidas became so important. His death could be placed at the beginning of a larger story that ended with Greek survival. That gave Thermopylae a meaning beyond its immediate military result. The Spartans were especially proud of this. Their king had died according to Spartan ideals. He had not fled. He had not surrendered. he had remained. And so his death became a model for future generations. But there is something fascinating about the Spartan relationship with death. The Spartans did not necessarily glorify death for its own sake. They glorified obedience. A soldier who died while maintaining his position had fulfilled his duty. A soldier who survived by abandoning his comrades could be disgraced. The emphasis was not simply on dying. It was on remaining where you were supposed to remain. That distinction mattered. A dead soldier was not automatically a hero. The manner of death mattered. The circumstances mattered. The duty mattered. This is why Thermopylae became so powerful. Leonidas had been placed in an impossible position. He remained. The 300 remained. The Thespians remained. And they died. Their deaths could therefore be presented as the purest possible expression of Spartan discipline. The famous memorial to the Spartans captured this idea. It remembered the men as having died obeying the laws. The wording was simple. The meaning was enormous. They did not die because someone had promised them victory. They died because they believed their duty required them to stay. And that concept traveled. Centuries later, people would continue to return to the idea. What does a person owe to the community? What does a soldier owe to his comrades? What does a leader owe to those who follow him? At what point does duty become sacrifice? And at what point does sacrifice become legend? There are no simple answers. Leonidas' story does not provide them. It only gives us a dramatic example. The ancient Greeks themselves understood that Thermopylae was complicated. They did not pretend the Spartans were the only heroes. The Thespians were honored. The Greeks who fought elsewhere were remembered. The naval victory at Salamis was celebrated. Plataea was celebrated. The war became a collection of connected victories and sacrifices. But Thermopylae remained emotionally unique, because it was a defeat. And defeat can sometimes make a story more powerful. Victory says, we succeeded. Sacrifice says, we chose. Those are different messages. And perhaps human beings are naturally drawn to stories where choice remains meaningful even when circumstances are hopeless. This is why last stands appear again and again throughout history. They are emotionally satisfying. A last stand creates a clear moment. There is no ambiguity about the danger, no easy escape, no comfortable compromise. The world becomes simple. Stay or leave. Fight or surrender. Leonidas stayed. That is the part people remember. But history itself is rarely so simple. The Greeks who withdrew from Thermopylae were not necessarily cowards. Many were making a strategic decision. If everyone had stayed, the entire Greek army might have been destroyed. The war might have ended differently. The retreat was necessary. The survivors would later fight again. This is another important lesson. Retreat is not always defeat. Sometimes survival is part of resistance. The people who left Thermopylae carried the war forward. The dead bought time. The living used it. This combination of sacrifice and survival helped save Greece. And yet the legend naturally focused on the dead. The dead cannot contradict the story. They cannot explain what they were thinking. They cannot complain that history has misunderstood them. They cannot say, actually, that is not what happened. The living can. And that makes dead heroes convenient. Leonidas became increasingly perfect because he was no longer around to be complicated. The same thing happened to other ancient figures. Death freezes a person. The living change. The dead become symbols. And Leonidas became one of the most enduring symbols in Greek memory. But the Greek world itself was changing. The Persian Wars had weakened the Persian threat to mainland Greece. Athens became increasingly powerful. The Delian League grew. Athens began using the alliance to build its own influence. Tribute flowed into Athens. The city rebuilt. Monuments rose. The famous temples of the Acropolis were eventually constructed. Athens entered what later generations would call its classical golden age. Philosophy flourished. Drama flourished. Democracy developed. Art flourished. And Sparta watched. At first, the relationship between Athens and Sparta remained manageable. But as Athens grew stronger, Sparta became concerned. The Greek world had survived Persia. Now it had a new problem. The Greeks themselves. This is one of history's favorite habits. People unite against an outside threat. Then, Once the threat disappears, they begin arguing with one another again. Eventually, the tensions became unbearable. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BCE. Sparta and its allies fought Athens and its allies. The conflict lasted for decades. It devastated the Greek world. And during this war, the memory of Leonidas became even more politically useful. Sparta needed to maintain its identity. Its citizens were taught to remember their ancestors. The story of Thermopylae reinforced the idea that Sparta was uniquely disciplined. The 300 became part of the moral education of Spartan society. Young men were expected to live up to the memory. Older men could remind them of it. Families could point to ancestors who had died. The story became a standard against which living Spartans were measured. But standards can become burdens. A society that constantly compares its present to a heroic past can become trapped by nostalgia. Sparta increasingly looked backward. The world was moving forward. Athens was experimenting with new forms of politics. Macedon was rising. Military technology was changing. Economic systems were changing. Sparta's old institutions remained. And eventually, they were not enough. In 371 BCE, at Leuctra, the Thebans defeated the Spartan army. The defeat was shocking. Spartan armies had once seemed almost invincible. Now they were beaten. The Thebans invaded the Peloponnese. Messenia was liberated. The Spartan economic system suffered a devastating blow. The old order was collapsing. The city of Sparta itself survived, but its power was no longer what it had been. The image of Leonidas, therefore, became increasingly separated from the actual Sparta of later centuries. The Spartan king of Thermopylae became an idealized ancestor, a reminder of a time when the city had seemed strong. This happens often in history. A declining society becomes fascinated by its own past. It looks backward and sees a golden age. The golden age may have been more complicated than memory admits. But nostalgia simplifies. It selects. It edits. It removes unpleasant details. And Leonidas was perfectly suited to this process. He was dead. He was victorious in memory. He had no later political failures. He had no old age. No scandal. No embarrassing speeches. No decline. He died at the height of the story. That is an extraordinarily powerful position for a historical figure. He never had to grow old in public. He never had to make a bad decision after Thermopylae. He never had to manage Sparta's decline. He never had to watch his reputation change. He simply stopped. And therefore, history could preserve him exactly where it wanted him, at the moment of courage. The same thing happens with many famous figures. A young person dies and becomes permanently young. A revolutionary dies before becoming corrupt. A king dies before becoming weak. A warrior dies before becoming old. Leonidas became the eternal king at the hot gates. The image never had to age. But there was another force that would carry his story much farther. Rome. The Romans conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE. The Greek city-states lost political independence. But Greek culture did not disappear. Instead, Greek ideas deeply influenced Rome. Roman writers studied Greek history. Roman elites admired Greek philosophy. Greek art became prestigious. And Greek historical figures became part of the wider Mediterranean cultural imagination. Leonidas was now no longer simply a Spartan hero. He became part of a larger classical tradition. Roman writers could look backward to Thermopylae and find lessons about courage, discipline, patriotism, and military honor. The battle became an example. And examples travel well. They do not require the audience to know every detail. You only need the shape of the story. Small force. Huge enemy. Last stand. Heroic death. The rest can be filled in later. Centuries passed. The ancient world transformed. Christianity spread. The Roman Empire changed. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Eastern Roman Empire survived for centuries. Greek language and culture continued in different forms. The ancient texts were copied, preserved, lost, rediscovered. Leonidas waited in the pages. Then the Renaissance arrived. European scholars became fascinated with ancient Greece and Rome. Artists returned to classical themes. The ancient world was rediscovered through manuscripts, ruins, statues, and inscriptions. Thermopylae returned to the cultural imagination. Leonidas returned with it. But now he could be used for new purposes. A Renaissance writer might see him as an example of classical virtue. A later European nationalist might see him as a symbol of resistance. A military writer might see him as an example of disciplined leadership. A political thinker might interpret Thermopylae as a struggle between freedom and despotism. The event itself remained the same. The meaning changed. That is the remarkable thing about historical memory. The past does not move. The interpretation does. And Leonidas was interpreted again and again. In the modern age, the story became even more dramatic. National movements discovered ancient heroes. The Greeks themselves, during the struggle for independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, looked back toward classical Greece. The ancient past became part of modern Greek identity. Thermopylae became a symbol of national continuity. The ancient Greeks were no longer merely historical figures. They were ancestors. Leonidas became part of a story about Greek endurance. The battlefield became a place of pilgrimage. Statues appeared. The old inscription was remembered. The phrase, "Come and take them," became famous far beyond Greece. And the number 300 became almost universal shorthand for impossible resistance. Yet the modern world did something ancient Greece had not. It turned Leonidas into a mass media character. Paintings gave him a face. Novels gave him dialogue. Films gave him movement. And eventually, modern cinema gave him an army of digital visual effects. The ancient king entered popular culture. This brought the story to millions of people. But it also created new distortions. Modern audiences often imagine the Spartans as nearly invincible superheroes. They were not. Their equipment was not magical. Their bodies were not made of bronze. They could be wounded. They could panic. They could die. Their military success depended on training, organization, equipment, terrain, and experience. And the 300 did not fight alone. The image of 300 men facing millions is dramatic. But it is not historically accurate. The Persian army was probably large, but not remotely as large as some ancient accounts suggest. The Greek defenders were also more numerous than 300. These corrections do not make Thermopylae less impressive. They make it more understandable. A small Greek force used terrain and discipline to delay a much larger invading army. Then, after being outflanked, many withdrew. A smaller group remained. That is already remarkable. It does not need impossible numbers. Reality is dramatic enough. And perhaps this is why the historical Leonidas is more interesting than the cinematic one. He did not have to be superhuman. He simply had to be human. A man standing in a place where his choices had consequences. A king who knew that his decision might become fatal. A soldier who had learned that his shield was connected to the man beside him. A husband who had a family. A father whose son would inherit his crown. A man whose life was about to become memory. There is something deeply sad about that. Because we know what Leonidas did not. We know that his story would survive. He did not. And yet perhaps survival through memory is one of the strange things human beings leave behind. A person dies, but their name remains. Someone writes it. Someone speaks it. Someone teaches it. Someone listens. Then another generation repeats it. And another. And another. Until a man who lived more than 2,000 years ago can still enter a room through a single sentence. Leonidas. A name. Nothing more. And yet somehow enough. The old king becomes present again. The mountains return. The shields return. The Persian army appears in the distance. The sun rises. The hot gates open. And for a few moments, the past becomes almost tangible. This is why history matters. Not because the past can be recovered perfectly. It cannot. But because fragments remain. A name. An inscription. A ruined wall. A story written by Herodotus. A later historian quoting an earlier one. A stone monument. A battlefield. A tradition. Together, these fragments allow us to approach people who have been gone for centuries. Not perfectly, but closely enough to wonder, what did Leonidas feel? Did he fear death? Did he regret anything? Did he think of Gorgo? Did he think of his son? Did he think Sparta would survive? Did he believe Greece could win? Did he know that the Persians would eventually be defeated? We do not know. And that uncertainty should remain. Because sometimes the most respectful thing we can do for the dead is not to invent their thoughts. We can admire the action without pretending to know the mind. Leonidas stayed. That is enough. The rest belongs to mystery. And perhaps mystery is what keeps history alive. If we knew everything, the story would become a closed box. Instead, it remains open. We can enter it. Walk around. Listen. Imagine. Question. And then step back. The night grows quieter. The old roads disappear. The ancient world becomes distant. And yet Leonidas remains. Not because he conquered an empire. He did not. Not because Sparta ruled forever. It did not. But because one moment of human decision became powerful enough to survive the collapse of the world that created it. The Persian Empire vanished. Sparta faded. Athens became ruins. The languages changed. The gods changed. The borders changed. The roads changed. And still the story remained. A king. A pass. 300. An empire. And a final refusal. Perhaps that is why Thermopylae still feels strangely intimate. Because underneath the armies and empires is something familiar. The feeling of standing in front of something larger than yourself. The feeling of knowing that you cannot control the outcome. The feeling of deciding what you will do anyway. Most of us will never stand in a mountain pass against an invading army. Thankfully. Most of us have enough trouble dealing with emails. But the emotional question is the same. What do we do when circumstances become larger than us? Do we run? Do we stay? Do we compromise? Do we fight? Do we accept? There is no single answer. Leonidas chose one. Other people chose differently. History remembers him because his choice became extraordinary. But ordinary people make difficult choices every day. They continue. They endure. They protect their families. They keep promises. They survive losses. They wake up the next morning. Perhaps courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes courage is simply continuing. Leonidas's courage happened to take place on a battlefield. And because the battlefield became famous, his courage became famous too. But the quiet courage of the people who survived Thermopylae was just as human. The people who returned home had to continue living. They had to bury friends. They had to raise children. They had to rebuild. They had to fight again. They had to carry memories. That too is courage. And perhaps the final image we should keep is not Leonidas dying. It is the people who lived. The survivors walking south. The refugees leaving Athens. The sailors returning from Salamis. The soldiers marching toward Plataea. The families waiting. The children growing. The world continuing. Because the purpose of sacrifice, at least in the Greek interpretation, was not death itself. It was survival. The dead bought time for the living, and the living used that time. That is how history moved forward. So now, as the centuries stretch beyond Thermopylae, let us slowly leave the battlefield behind. The mountains grow distant. The Persian army becomes a memory. Sparta becomes a name. Leonidas becomes a statue. The statue becomes an image. The image becomes a story, and the story becomes something each generation carries differently. But beneath every version is the same quiet truth. Leonidas was mortal. His courage was not magic. His army was not invincible. His victory was not guaranteed. He simply stood. And sometimes, that is enough to make a person unforgettable. The night settles over the old land. The fires go out. The road becomes empty. The springs continue to flow. And the stars, which watch the Persian army march and the Spartan king fall, continue shining as though none of it ever happened. Perhaps that is the most peaceful way to end this part of the story. Not with a battle cry. Not with a speech. But with silence. The kind of silence that comes after history has finished shouting. The kind of silence in which the past can finally rest. And somewhere, beneath the quiet stars, Leonidas remains exactly where memory left him. At the hot gates. Waiting. The long shadow of Thermopylae. There are battles that change the map. There are battles that destroy kingdoms. There are battles that decide who owns a river, a city, a coastline, a mountain pass. And then there are battles that seem to change something less visible. They change the imagination. Thermopylae was one of those battles. The Persian army had won. The road had opened. The Greek defenders had been killed. If we measure the battle by territory, casualties, and immediate military objectives, there is little ambiguity. Persia won. And yet, centuries later, people would speak of Thermopylae as though it belonged to the defeated. That is unusual. It tells us that the battlefield became more than a military event. It became a story about choice. And stories about choice have a habit of surviving. So let us leave ancient Sparta for a while. Let us leave the mountains of Greece. Let us allow the centuries to pass. Slowly. Quietly. One generation at a time. Leonidas has already died. His son has inherited the throne. Sparta continues. Persia continues. Athens continues. And somewhere, children are being born who will never know the world Leonidas knew. They will grow up after the Persian Wars. They will hear stories of the invasion. They will hear that the great King Xerxes came with an enormous army. They will hear that Athens burned. They will hear that the Greeks fought at sea. They will hear about Plataea. And they will hear about the 300. Perhaps an old grandfather tells the story beside a fire. Perhaps a soldier who fought in the later stages of the war tells a child what he remembers. Perhaps the child asks why Leonidas stayed. And perhaps the answer is simple. Because he was a Spartan. That answer would have carried enormous meaning in ancient Greece. To us, Spartan often means someone who lives simply or exercises intensely. A person might sleep on a hard mattress and proudly announce that they are living like a Spartan. Ancient Spartans might have found this amusing. Their idea of simplicity was not a lifestyle choice. It was a social system. The Spartan citizen was expected to place the community above personal comfort. The Agoge had prepared boys for this. The common messes reinforced it. Military training reinforced it. Public expectations reinforced it. The entire society repeated the message. Do not abandon your place. Do not shame your family. Do not abandon your comrades. Do not run when you are expected to stand. This was not simply military instruction. It was identity. And identity is powerful. People will endure extraordinary things when they believe those things define who they are. The 300 had spent their lives becoming Spartans. At Thermopylae, they were asked to demonstrate what that identity meant. They did. But there is another question. What did Thermopylae mean to the people who were not Spartans? This is where the story becomes wider. The Thespians. Their city was located in Boeotia. They had sent approximately 700 men to Thermopylae. When the Greek position was about to collapse, they stayed. They knew what that meant. Their sacrifice was enormous. And yet for centuries, the number 300 overshadowed them. This is partly because numbers make stories easier. 300 Spartans. It sounds like a complete myth. But the Thespians were there. And their choice deserves its own quiet space in the story. They were not Spartan citizens. They did not have exactly the same political culture. They did not have the same traditions. Yet they remained. Perhaps they understood that the battle had become about more than their own city. Perhaps they simply followed their leaders. Perhaps they believed retreat was impossible. Perhaps several motives existed at once. We cannot know. But they stayed. And when the battle ended, they were dead. The Thebans who remained also suffered. Ancient accounts suggest that the circumstances of their presence were different. Some may have been unwilling participants. Some were captured. Their story is less comfortable than the heroic simplicity of the 300. And again, history is complicated. The battle contained courage, fear, confusion, loyalty, coercion, calculation, and survival. It was not a perfectly organized stage play. It was war. War is rarely tidy. But the Greek memory of Thermopylae increasingly became tidy. The Spartans became the heroes. Leonidas became the central figure. The Thespians became a secondary memory. The Persians became the massive enemy. And Xerxes became the face of imperial power. The actual Persian soldiers, however, were human too. This is worth remembering. The men who attacked Thermopylae were not monsters. They came from different regions of the empire. They had families. They had languages. They had beliefs. Some were professional soldiers. Others were levied or allied troops. Some may have wanted the rewards of service. Others may simply have followed orders. They marched because their king commanded them, and many died. When we tell stories about heroic resistance, it is easy to turn the enemy into a faceless mass. But the Persians were people. They had their own histories, their own cultures, their own understanding of the war. To the Persian Empire, the invasion of Greece may have been understood as imperial expansion, punishment, strategic necessity, or all three. The Persian king was not necessarily thinking in terms of a simple battle between good and evil. Empires rarely describe themselves as villains. They describe themselves as order. They see conquest as stability. They see resistance as rebellion. This is one of the oldest patterns in human history. The empire says, "We bring order." The people being conquered say, "You are invading." Both perspectives can exist simultaneously, and Thermopylae was caught between them. The Greeks saw a foreign army. Persia saw resistance to imperial authority. The battle therefore became a clash not just of armies, but of political worlds. The Greek city-state was small. The Persian Empire was enormous. One valued local autonomy. The other valued imperial unity. Neither system was perfect. Neither was entirely free. But their structures were radically different. That contrast made the war memorable. The Greeks could imagine themselves as communities defending their independence. The Persians could imagine themselves as an empire bringing rebellious territories into submission. History would later simplify this into freedom versus tyranny. But the ancient reality was more complicated. Greek cities themselves conquered neighbors. Athens built an empire of its own through the Delian League. Sparta controlled Messenia. Greek societies practiced slavery. So the line between freedom and domination was never as clean as later generations imagined. Still, the symbolic power of the story remained. And that symbolic power grew over time. When Herodotus wrote his history, he was preserving memories from a war that had happened within living memory. He was not writing thousands of years later. The world of Leonidas was still close. People could still remember the descendants of those involved. Stories could be checked against other stories. The battle had not yet become distant legend. But even then, Herodotus understood that stories mattered. His history is full of speeches. Modern historians often doubt that the speeches were recorded word for word. And of course they were not. No ancient journalist stood beside Leonidas with a microphone. The speeches were literary reconstructions. But that does not mean they are meaningless. A reconstructed speech tells us what the author believed the person represented. Leonidas's words were shaped to express Spartan values. Short, direct, unyielding. This was the Leonidas the Greeks wanted to remember. A king who spoke as briefly as his culture expected. A man who did not need to explain himself. Perhaps he did speak that way. Perhaps not. But the story needed him to. And so he became laconic even in death. His reputation grew. Ancient writers continued to mention Sparta. Philosophers debated the Spartan constitution. Plutarch, writing centuries after Leonidas, collected stories about Spartan leaders. By then, the historical distance was enormous. Plutarch was not a contemporary. He was writing biography with moral purpose. He wanted to explore character. What did courage look like? What did leadership look like? What did virtue look like? Leonidas was therefore perfect material. His life ended in a dramatic test. His final actions seemed to reveal his character. And this is another reason his story survived. It fits biography. It fits morality. It fits literature. It fits politics. It fits military history. Everyone can find something in it. A soldier sees discipline. A politician sees leadership. A philosopher sees duty. A nationalist sees resistance. A storyteller sees tragedy. A filmmaker sees spectacle. And someone trying to fall asleep to history sees a mountain pass at night. Perhaps that is why the story keeps returning. Because it is flexible. The basic facts are fixed. The meaning is not. Centuries after Plutarch, the ancient world became increasingly distant. But its ruins remained. The Greek landscape preserved traces of the past. Stone walls. Temple foundations. Broken statues. Old roads. Burial sites. Thermopylae itself changed. The coastline moved. The sea is not where it was in exactly the same way. Sediment altered the landscape. The narrow pass became wider over the centuries. The geography of the ancient battle cannot simply be imagined from the modern road. The land itself changed. That is another quiet reminder of time. Even mountains have histories. The battlefield that seemed permanent was not permanent. The coast moved. Rivers shifted. Human settlements disappeared. And yet memory adapted. People still came to the region. They still remembered the battle. They still looked for the hot gates. A place can survive in memory even when the physical landscape changes. And perhaps this is one of the most remarkable things about human beings. We remember places that no longer exist exactly as they once did. We reconstruct them. We imagine them. We tell stories about them. Thermopylae became less a precise geographical location and more an idea. The hot gates. The place where the few stood against the many. That idea could travel anywhere. And it did. In later centuries, people facing their own crises began to compare themselves to Leonidas. Revolutionaries. Soldiers. Political movements. Nationalists. People fighting overwhelming odds. Sometimes the comparison was reasonable. Sometimes it was wildly exaggerated. But the name remained useful. Leonidas became a shorthand for resistance. And whenever a culture needs a symbol of resistance, it searches history for someone who stood when retreat seemed easier. Leonidas was always available. He never needed to be consulted. He could be claimed by almost anyone. This is both the power and danger of historical symbols. Once a person becomes a symbol, they stop belonging entirely to themselves. Everyone interprets them. Everyone uses them. Everyone adds meaning. And the historical man becomes increasingly difficult to see. Modern popular culture would eventually make this even more dramatic. The 20th century brought films about ancient Greece. The image of the Spartan warrior became increasingly stylized. Muscular bodies. Red cloaks. Bronze shields. Slow-motion battle scenes. Heroic speeches. And eventually, the famous number became the title of a major modern film. The film introduced millions of people to the story, but it also deliberately exaggerated the ancient world. The movie version of Sparta is not historical Sparta. It is mythology shaped by modern visual culture. The real Spartans did not fight monsters. They did not shout cinematic slogans every few minutes. Their equipment was not designed by a modern costume department. And Leonidas did not spend his final days behaving like a superhero. But the film did capture something real. The emotional shape. A small force. A huge empire. A narrow pass. A king who refuses to surrender. The story works because the underlying human drama is powerful. You can remove the fantasy. You can remove the exaggerated numbers. You can remove the monsters. The core still works. A person can stand in a place where they know the odds are against them. That is enough. And perhaps that is why people have continued telling the story. Not because they believe the ancient world was perfect, but because they recognize something familiar. The feeling of being outnumbered. The feeling of facing circumstances larger than yourself. The desire to believe that courage still matters even when victory is uncertain. This is not exclusively a Spartan idea. Every culture has stories like this. Every civilization remembers people who stood against overwhelming odds. Some became martyrs. Some became heroes. Some became villains. Some became legends. The details change. The emotional structure remains. And Thermopylae became Greece's great version of the story. But there is a quieter side to the legend. The people who lived after Leonidas. Because Sparta did not disappear after Thermopylae, the city continued for centuries. The royal house continued. The citizens continued. The helots continued. The old laws continued. Children continued to train. The meals continued. The political arguments continued. Someone still had to complain about the weather. Someone still had to repair a roof. Someone still had to harvest olives. Someone still had to care for animals. History is full of these invisible people. They are rarely remembered. And yet they carried the world forward. Leonidas died. Someone else had to wake up the next morning. That may be the most important truth hidden inside the story. Heroic death is dramatic. Survival is repetitive. But survival is what builds the future. The people who survived Thermopylae carried the memory. They fought at Salamis. They fought at Plataea. They returned home. They raised families. They told stories. And those stories eventually reached people who had never seen Leonidas. The legend was transmitted, one voice to another, generation to generation. This is how history survived before books were widely available. Memory traveled orally. A grandfather told a child. A soldier told a recruit. A poet told an audience. A teacher told students. A writer recorded the story. And eventually, the story crossed centuries. Leonidas became part of the shared inheritance of the Mediterranean world. Even after Sparta declined, the story remained useful. It reminded later Greeks of a time when their ancestors had faced Persia. It reminded Romans of military discipline. It reminded Europeans of classical virtue. It reminded modern audiences of resistance. And it reminds us now that the past is never simply dead. It continues to be interpreted. Every generation asks new questions of old people. We ask Leonidas different questions than Herodotus did. We might ask about slavery, about political power, about gender, about imperialism, about nationalism, about historical memory. Ancient Greeks asked different questions. What is honor? What is duty? What does a good citizen owe his city? What does courage mean? What happens when the laws demand sacrifice? Neither set of questions is wrong. They simply belong to different times. And perhaps the best way to understand Leonidas is to allow all of them into the room. Do not turn him into a perfect hero. Do not turn him into a villain because Sparta was imperfect. Do not turn Thermopylae into a simple morality tale. Instead, allow the contradictions to remain. Leonidas can be courageous. Sparta can be oppressive. The Persian soldiers can be brave. The Persian Empire can be imperial. The Greeks can fight for autonomy while practicing slavery. The battle can be a military defeat and a cultural victory. All of these can be true. History is large enough for contradictions. In fact, history is mostly contradictions. That is what makes it interesting. And now, as we move toward the final part of Leonidas' story, there is one more journey to make. Not through ancient Greece, not through Persia, but through memory itself. We need to ask why this particular story became so powerful. Why Leonidas? Why Thermopylae? Why 300? Why has this battle survived when thousands of other ancient battles are barely remembered? Perhaps the answer lies in the structure of the story. It has everything. A king. An empire. A small band of defenders. A narrow mountain pass. A betrayal. A final stand. Death. Sacrifice. And then victory somewhere else. It is almost too perfectly shaped. Real life rarely provides stories this neat. But Thermopylae does. The tragedy comes first. The meaning comes later. And that makes the story emotionally powerful. The dead do not see the outcome. The living create the meaning. Leonidas dies believing only that he must stand. Later generations look backward and say, his stand mattered. That is the mystery of sacrifice. We rarely know what our actions will mean. The people at Thermopylae could not see the future. Neither can we. Perhaps that is the lesson beneath the legend. We live forward. We understand backward. Leonidas walked into the past without knowing how history would judge him. We sit thousands of years later with the advantage of hindsight. We know that Persia would fail. We know Sparta would decline. We know the Persian Empire would eventually fall. We know the Greek world would change. We know Rome would rise. We know all of it. But Leonidas knew none of it. He had only his moment. And perhaps that is what makes his story so human. Every person lives that way. We wake up without knowing the full story of our own lives. We make decisions without knowing what they will become. We choose. We continue. And someday, someone else may remember what we did. Or they may not. Most people disappear from history. That is normal. Leonidas was unusual. His final choice became memorable. But the millions of people who lived ordinary lives around him mattered too. They grew crops, built houses, raised children, made pottery, sailed ships, sold food, prayed, laughed, argued, loved, and slept. Their lives made the world in which Leonidas could exist. Without them, there would have been no Sparta, no army, no grain, no roads, no ships, no history. So perhaps the story of Leonidas is also the story of everyone whose name was never recorded. The people behind the warrior, the farmers behind the army, the families behind the soldiers, the craftsmen behind the weapons, the women who maintained households, the helots who worked the land, the messengers who carried information, the sailors who rowed the ships, the cooks who fed the troops, the unnamed people who made extraordinary events possible without ever becoming famous. History remembers the king, but the world was built by everyone else. And as we let the story slow down, that thought becomes strangely peaceful. The ancient world was not only battles. It was mornings. It was bread. It was water. It was smoke rising from houses. It was children playing. It was people arguing over small things. It was farmers watching the sky. It was merchants counting coins. It was women weaving. It was old men sitting in the shade. It was soldiers sleeping before battle. Life continued. Even while empires moved. Even while kings planned. Even while Leonidas marched north. And perhaps this is the final image worth keeping. Not the battlefield. Not the dead. But a quiet Spartan morning before all of it happened. The sun rises over the valley. The Eurotas River glimmers. The mountains stand beyond the fields. Smoke rises from small houses. A child wakes. A farmer steps outside. Somewhere, a soldier prepares his equipment. Somewhere else, Leonidas walks through the city. No one knows what the future will bring. No one knows that Persia is coming. No one knows that Thermopylae will become one of the most famous battles in history. For now, it is simply another morning. And that is how history usually begins. Quietly. Without announcing itself. The future arrives disguised as an ordinary day. Then suddenly, centuries later, someone looks back and realizes that the day was not ordinary at all. It was the beginning of a story, and Leonidas' story is now almost finished. The man is gone. The kingdom is gone. The empire is gone. But the question remains. What makes a life memorable? Is it victory? Power? Wealth? Fame? Or is it the way someone behaves when the outcome is uncertain? We cannot know exactly what Leonidas believed, but we know what he did. He stayed. And that simple action became larger than his life. Perhaps that is why, even now, when we hear the name Thermopylae, we imagine the mountains, the narrow road, the shields, the red cloaks, the king, and somewhere beyond them, the endless Persian army. But after the images fade, there is something quieter, a single human thought. I cannot control what happens next, but I can decide what I do now. That thought is not uniquely Spartan. It belongs to everyone. And perhaps that is why the story has lasted. Because beneath the ancient armor, we recognize ourselves. We too stand in places we cannot control. We too face things larger than ourselves. We too make choices without knowing the ending. And we too hope that our choices will mean something. Leonidas did not know that his final stand would become a story told for more than 2,000 years. He simply stood. The rest came later. Much later. The mountains remember nothing. The stones remember nothing. The sea remembers nothing. Only people remember. And perhaps that is why history feels so fragile. It survives only when someone tells it again. Tonight, we have told it again. The Persian army has come. The Greeks have gathered. The Spartans have marched. The king has fallen. The empire has passed. And now the story is quiet. The fires at Thermopylae have gone dark. The shields are resting. The road is empty. The hot gates are silent. The stars remain. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of ordinary time, the old story continues to breathe. Not loudly. Not triumphantly. But softly. Like wind through mountain grass. Like water moving over stone. Like a name whispered in the dark. Leonidas. And then, after the name, silence. The kind of silence that belongs to very old stories. The kind of silence that lets the dead rest, and the living sleep. The king who became a symbol. There is a strange thing about dying at the right moment in history. Not the right moment for yourself, of course. There is nothing particularly convenient about dying. But for the purposes of memory, there are deaths that become almost impossible to separate from the identity of the person who died. Leonidas was one of those people. He did not live long enough to become an old king. He did not have decades of political mistakes waiting behind him. He did not have to watch his kingdom slowly weaken. He did not have to face the humiliations that would eventually come to Sparta. He died before any of that could happen. His life ended at the exact point where the story became most dramatic. And history, being rather fond of dramatic endings, never really let him go. But if we slow down and look beyond the famous final stand, another story begins. It is the story of what happens when a dead man becomes useful to the living. Because Leonidas was useful, his memory could teach. It could frighten. It could inspire. It could justify. It could remind. It could even be used as a weapon, not a physical weapon. Something quieter. A standard. A comparison. A young Spartan could be asked whether he was worthy of the men who died at Thermopylae. A soldier could be reminded of Leonidas before battle. A politician could invoke the courage of the ancestors. A writer could hold Leonidas up as an example of virtue. And a society could look at the dead king and say, in effect, this is what we expect from you. The dead can become demanding. They never ask us directly, but we imagine their expectations. And perhaps that was especially true in Sparta. The entire Spartan system was built around the idea that the individual existed within a larger community. From childhood, Spartan boys were taught that their lives were connected to the city. Their education was harsh. Their food was deliberately plain. Their physical training was demanding. They learned endurance. They learned obedience. They learned to move as part of a group. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that shame could be more frightening than pain. The Spartan ideal was not simply to be strong. It was to be reliable. A shield was valuable because it protected the man beside you. If a soldier dropped his shield and ran, he did not merely save himself. He exposed another man. That was the deeper meaning. Your courage belonged partly to the person next to you. Your cowardice did too. A formation depended on trust. A city depended on trust. And so the story of Leonidas could be told as the ultimate example of communal responsibility. He did not stay because he believed his life was more valuable than everyone else's. Quite the opposite. His life became valuable because he was willing to risk it for the larger group. That was the message. At least, that was the message later generations wanted to hear. But there was another side to this. The Spartan system demanded enormous conformity. There was little room for the individual who wanted to live differently. A boy who hated military training could not simply decide to become a poet and move to Athens. A young man who wanted a quiet life outside the common messes had limited choices. The community came first. This produced discipline. It also produced pressure. And pressure can create extraordinary courage. It can also create extraordinary suffering. The same system that produced Leonidas produced thousands of ordinary men who never became famous. They trained. They marched. They obeyed. Some survived. Some died. Most were forgotten. That is the strange mathematics of history. Thousands make a system possible. One becomes a legend. Leonidas was the one. But he stood on the shoulders of countless people whose names disappeared. The farmers. The armorers. The servants. The helots. The women. The children. The old men. The soldiers who never fought at a famous battle. All of them belong to the world that produced Thermopylae. And so when we admire Leonidas, we are really looking at the visible peak of an enormous social structure. The peak is easy to see. The structure beneath it is harder. Yet without that structure, the peak would not exist. This is why Sparta is such an interesting civilization to study. It was not simply a city full of warriors. It was a society organized around the production of warriors. Everything connected to everything else. Land. Labor. Family. Education. Religion. Politics. Military service. The system had been developing for generations. Leonidas did not invent it. He was one of its products. And perhaps that makes his final decision less mysterious. He had spent his entire life being taught what a Spartan king was supposed to do. Then Persia arrived. The test came. He answered according to the world that had shaped him. This does not make his courage less real. It makes it understandable. People rarely create themselves entirely. We inherit values. We inherit fears. We inherit expectations. We inherit stories. Then, at certain moments, we act. Leonidas's action was shaped by Sparta. But the meaning of that action escaped Sparta. That is what made him extraordinary. The battle became larger than the society that created it. And eventually, the story would be understood by people who knew nothing about the Spartan political system. They would know only one thing. Leonidas stood. That was enough. But let us return to the ancient world. After the Persian Wars, Sparta had survived. Yet survival was not the same as stability. The city was facing long-term problems. One of them was population. The number of full Spartan citizens declined. This mattered enormously. Sparta's military system depended upon citizens who could afford the lifestyle expected of them. A full Spartan citizen was supposed to contribute to the common mess. He needed land and resources, but wealth was not evenly distributed. Over time, some families accumulated more property. Others lost their holdings. Those who could no longer meet the economic requirements of citizenship could lose status. And as the citizen population shrank, the army's traditional foundation weakened. This was a slow process. There was no single morning when Sparta woke up and discovered that it had declined. Decline is usually much less dramatic than that. It arrives quietly. One family loses land. Another gains it. A generation has fewer citizens than the previous one. A military class becomes smaller. A political institution becomes less flexible. The city still appears powerful. Visitors still admire its soldiers. But underneath, the structure is changing. This is why the image of Sparta can be misleading. The Sparta remembered by history is often the Sparta of its greatest confidence. The Sparta that produced Leonidas. The Sparta that fought Persia. The Sparta that defeated Athens. But there were other Spartas. Older. Weaker. More anxious. More divided. And eventually, less powerful. In 371 BCE, the Battle of Leuctra exposed this weakness. The Thespians, under Epaminondas, defeated the Spartan army. The shock was enormous. For generations, the Spartan military reputation had been one of the strongest in Greece. Now it had been broken. The Thespians marched into territory that Sparta had long dominated. Messenia was freed. For Sparta, this was catastrophic. The loss of Messenia meant the loss of the agricultural labor system that had supported Spartan society for centuries. The old model could not simply be repaired. The world had changed. The great Spartan army that later generations imagined was no longer possible in the same form. And this gives us an interesting contrast. Leonidas became more famous as Sparta became less powerful. His legend grew while his city declined. The further Sparta moved from its ancient strength, the more attractive the memory of that strength became. The dead king became an idealized past. And perhaps every declining society does something similar. It looks backward. It remembers the years when it seemed strong. It tells stories about ancestors. It builds monuments. It repeats old virtues. Sometimes this preserves valuable lessons. Sometimes it creates nostalgia. Sometimes it does both. Sparta's memory became larger than Sparta itself. The city could no longer dominate Greece. But Leonidas could still dominate the imagination. And this is where history begins to separate into two worlds. There is the world of what happened, and there is the world of what people believe happened. The two worlds overlap, but they are never identical. The historical Leonidas was a king of a small Greek state. The legendary Leonidas became the embodiment of resistance. The historical Thermopylae was a battle during a complicated invasion. The legendary Thermopylae became the eternal last stand. The historical 300 were a selected group of Spartan citizens. The legendary 300 became almost an army of mythological heroes. The difference matters. But the difference is not necessarily a problem. Legends can reveal what people value. When a society repeatedly tells the same story, it is telling us something about itself. The Spartans valued discipline. The Greeks valued resistance to foreign domination. Later Europeans valued classical courage. Modern cultures value individual heroism. The story changes slightly because the audience changes. Leonidas becomes a mirror, and mirrors are rarely neutral. They show us ourselves. Centuries passed. The ancient gods faded from common worship. Christianity transformed the Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire changed. The Eastern Roman Empire survived. Greek language remained important. Ancient texts were copied by scholars and monks. Some were lost. Others survived. Herodotus survived. Plutarch survived. And with them, Leonidas survived. Imagine a manuscript being copied centuries after the battle. A scribe sits in a quiet room. The parchment lies in front of him. He carefully forms the letters. Perhaps outside, rain is falling. Perhaps a fire is burning nearby. Perhaps he has never seen Sparta. Perhaps he has never visited Greece. Yet he writes the name Leonidas, a man who died centuries before his own ancestors were born. The scribe may never realize that he is helping preserve a memory that will survive for another 1,000 years. This is how history sometimes travels. Not through grand monuments, through quiet hands. Someone copies a sentence. Someone stores a manuscript. Someone finds it. Someone translates it. Someone publishes it. Someone reads it. And suddenly a dead king is alive again in the imagination. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in Greece and Rome. European scholars looked backward. They admired classical literature. Artists studied ancient sculpture. Political thinkers examined ancient governments. Sparta became particularly fascinating. Why? Because Sparta seemed so different from the societies around them. It represented discipline, order, military virtue, simplicity, self-control. At least in the imagination. The real Sparta was more complicated. But the imagined Sparta was incredibly useful. A writer could say, "Look at the Spartans." A politician could say, "We need Spartan discipline." A military officer could say, "We need Spartan courage." A parent could say, "We need Spartan toughness." The adjective Spartan escaped the ancient world. It became part of modern language. And Leonidas was at the center of it. The word itself became a compliment. Simple. Severe. Disciplined. Unwilling to complain. Which is slightly amusing when you think about how often modern people use it. Someone eats plain food for 3 days and announces that they are living like a Spartan. Somewhere in the ancient world, a helot is probably rolling his eyes. But the fascination continued. Pain became part of the romantic image. Hardship became virtue. The Spartan warrior became an icon. And Thermopylae became the ultimate demonstration. A place where discomfort was irrelevant. A place where fear was irrelevant. A place where victory was irrelevant. Only duty mattered. This interpretation is powerful, but it can also become dangerous if taken too literally. Because suffering is not automatically noble. Death is not automatically meaningful. Sacrifice is not automatically good. The story of Leonidas matters because he chose to act within a particular historical situation. It should not be used to suggest that all suffering is valuable, or that obedience is always virtuous, or that leaders should always sacrifice their followers. The ancient world had its own moral framework. We can study it without copying it. That is one of the responsibilities of history, to understand without blindly worshiping, to admire without romanticizing, to criticize without dismissing, to hold contradictions. Leonidas deserves that complexity. So does Sparta. So does Persia. So does Thermopylae. The Persian Empire, after all, was not simply a machine of destruction. It was one of the most sophisticated political systems of the ancient world. It governed enormous territories. It connected different cultures. It built roads. It organized taxation. It supported trade. It used local traditions. Its rulers could be remarkably pragmatic. The empire was not simply a villain waiting for a Greek hero to defeat it. It was a civilization. And its soldiers were people. The Persian invasion of Greece was one chapter in a much larger imperial history. The empire would survive Xerxes. It would survive the failure in Greece. It would continue for generations. Eventually, however, another conqueror would arrive. Alexander of Macedon. He would cross into Asia. He would defeat Persian armies. He would capture Persian cities. And the empire that had once sent Xerxes toward Greece would eventually collapse. This is one of history's great ironies. The empire that looked so overwhelming at Thermopylae did not last forever. Neither did Sparta. Nothing did. The monuments of power are temporary. The stories can be longer. Alexander himself would die young. His empire would fragment. His successors would fight each other. New kingdoms would rise. Rome would eventually dominate the Mediterranean. Rome would absorb Greek culture. Greek philosophy would influence Roman thinkers. Greek literature would become essential to Roman education. And somewhere in that cultural inheritance was Thermopylae. The Roman world admired courage. Roman military culture had its own traditions of sacrifice and discipline. Roman writers could look at Leonidas and see something familiar. A commander who accepted death. A leader who placed duty above survival. A soldier whose reputation became larger than his lifespan. The ancient Mediterranean was becoming a conversation between cultures. Greek stories moved into Roman libraries. Roman ideas moved into Greek cities. The old world was constantly borrowing from itself. Leonidas became part of that conversation. Then Rome changed. The Western Empire collapsed. The Mediterranean world fragmented. Yet the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire continued. Ancient Greek texts survived in libraries. Scholars continued reading them. Centuries later, Western European scholars became fascinated by these surviving texts. The classical past was rediscovered. And again, Leonidas returned. This time, not as a living memory, as an archaeological and literary figure. The ruins of Greece became objects of fascination. Travelers visited. Artists sketched. Writers described. The landscape became a place where the imagination could meet antiquity. Thermopylae became a destination, a place where modern people could stand and think about the ancient dead. And there is something deeply strange about visiting an ancient battlefield. The place itself often looks ordinary. There may be a road, a field, a hill, a modern building, cars passing, electricity, signs, people checking their phones. And beneath all of this, an ancient memory. You look around and think, this is where they stood. But the world does not look like the world they knew. The land has changed. The people have changed. The language has changed. The gods have changed. And yet the question remains, what happened here? What did they see? What did they hear? What did the final hours feel like? We cannot know completely, but we can imagine. And perhaps imagination is not the enemy of history. Uncontrolled imagination is. Careful imagination can help us understand scale. It can help us remember that historical people were not names on pages. They were bodies. They were tired. They were thirsty. They were afraid. They had sore feet. They missed their families. They ate meals. They slept. They laughed. They complained. They sometimes wanted to go home. And then they made choices. This is why the story of Leonidas should not be reduced to a statue. The statue is frozen. The man was not. He moved. He breathed. He aged. He had relationships. He made mistakes. He had political enemies. He had responsibilities. He had doubts. And then he died. That is more interesting than perfection, because perfection is impossible for human beings. The historical Leonidas was not a myth. He was a man. And men are complicated. Kings are complicated. Societies are complicated. History is complicated. The story becomes more meaningful when we allow it to remain so. Now, there is another question. What exactly did Leonidas accomplish at Thermopylae? The answer depends on how we measure accomplishment. Militarily, the Greek position was defeated. Persia passed through. The Greek army retreated. The defenders died. So if we ask whether Leonidas won the battle, the answer is no. But if we ask whether the defense mattered to the larger war, the answer is more complicated. The Greek resistance at Thermopylae bought time. It demonstrated that the Persian army could be challenged. It gave the Greek coalition an opportunity to continue organizing. The real strategic value of the battle was not that it stopped Persia permanently. It did not. Its value was that it delayed the advance and became part of a larger resistance. Thermopylae was one movement in a much larger composition. Salamis followed. Plataea followed. Mycale followed. The Persian invasion failed, and Leonidas became associated with that eventual survival. That is why defeat could become heroic. The battle itself was lost. The war was not. This distinction matters. The dead did not win the war. The living did. But the dead gave the living something. Time. Confidence. A story. A symbol. And symbols can influence people. When a community believes that others have sacrificed for it, that community may become more willing to continue. This is why memorials matter. A memorial is not simply a stone. It is a conversation between generations. The living stand before the dead. The living say, "We remember." And the dead, of course, say nothing. But the silence itself becomes meaningful. Thermopylae eventually became one of those places. The memorials reminded visitors that people had died there. Not kings in the abstract. Men. Names. Families. Lives. The famous inscription associated with the Spartans became perhaps the most concise summary of the entire ideal. The men had obeyed the laws. That was their justification. Not conquest. Not wealth. Not glory. Duty. And perhaps that is why the story has such staying power. Modern societies may disagree deeply about what duty means, but everyone understands the feeling of having obligations larger than oneself. To family. To friends. To a community. To a cause. To a promise. The specifics change. The emotion does not. That is why an ancient story can still feel strangely modern. We recognize the question, what do I owe? What am I willing to sacrifice? Where's the line? When should I stay? When should I leave? Leonidas answered in one way. Others answered differently. History gives us the examples. It does not always give us the solution. And perhaps that is better. Because the moment history becomes a set of simple instructions, it stops being history. It becomes propaganda. Leonidas deserves better than that. So let us return once more to the landscape. The mountains. The narrow pass. The sea. Imagine it without modern roads. Without cars. Without signs. Without tourists. Imagine a dry summer afternoon. Dust rising beneath sandals. Bronze catching the sunlight. The smell of sweat and leather. The smell of cooking fires. The sound of men speaking in different languages. Persian. Greek. Lydian. Egyptian. Median. Phoenician. The empire had brought the languages of half the ancient world to one battlefield, and among them was a small group of Spartans. They were not the entire Greek resistance. They were not the only brave men, but they became the most famous. 300 names became a number. The number became a legend. The legend became a symbol, and the symbol survived the empire. It survived Sparta. It survived Rome. It survived the medieval world. It survived the rise of Christianity. It survived the Renaissance. It survived modern nationalism. It survived cinema. And now it survives in a story being told at night. That is an extraordinary journey for a human life. Leonidas never traveled farther than the ancient world allowed. His memory traveled farther than he could have imagined. Perhaps that is the strange immortality available to ordinary mortals. Not living forever, being remembered. And yet even memory eventually fades. Names disappear. Languages vanish. Libraries burn. Civilizations collapse. Statues break. Eventually, almost everything becomes dust. So perhaps Leonidas's immortality is not truly immortality. It is borrowed time. Every generation gives the story another few years, another few decades, another few centuries. Someone remembers, then someone else. And one day, Perhaps no one will. That is the fate of almost every human story, even the most famous. The thought can sound sad, but perhaps it is peaceful. Nothing needs to last forever to have mattered. A life can be brief. A battle can be brief. A civilization can be brief. Meaning does not require permanence. Leonidas did not need to live forever. He lived. He chose. He died. And later people decided that his choice was worth remembering. That is enough. So as the night deepens, let us let the legend become quiet. Let the bronze helmets disappear. Let the shields become dark circles in the distance. Let the Persian army become a shadow. Let the shouting fade. The pass is empty again. The grass bends in the wind. The sea moves. The mountains stand. And the old inscription waits. Not shouting. Not demanding. Simply remembering. A few words. A few names. A few hundred men. And a king. Leonidas. The name remains. But beneath the name is something smaller. A human being. A father. A husband. A brother. A son. A citizen. A king. A soldier. A man who once woke up beneath the same sun that shines on us now. And perhaps that is where we should leave him. Not as a superhero. Not as a perfect warrior. But as a human being who lived in a difficult world, inherited a difficult duty, and made a choice that outlived him. The rest belongs to time. Time carries everything away. Empires. Armies. Cities. Kings. Even mountains eventually change. But tonight, for a few quiet hours, we can let the old story remain. The Persian ships are still somewhere beyond the horizon. The Spartan camp is quiet. The soldiers sleep. The fires burn low. The king looks toward the mountains. Tomorrow will come. He does not know exactly what it will bring. Neither do we. And perhaps that is the final connection between his world and ours. We all live before tomorrow. We all move toward an ending we cannot fully see. We all leave things behind. A word. A memory. A child. A story. A gesture. A name. And sometimes, against all probability, the story remains. So let the night become darker now. Let the ancient road disappear. Let Thermopylae return to silence. Let Leonidas rest. Let the empire fade. Let Sparta sleep. And as the last image disappears into the darkness, remember only this. The most famous men in history were once ordinary human beings living through ordinary mornings. They did not know they were becoming legends. Leonidas did not wake up one morning thinking, "Today I will become a symbol for thousands of years." He simply woke up. He put on his armor. He went where duty required. And then history happened. Quietly at first. Violently for a moment. And then slowly, over centuries, it became a story. A story told beside fires. A story written on parchment. A story carved into stone. A story painted on canvas. A story filmed on screens. A story whispered into headphones late at night. And now the story is almost still. The road is empty. The mountains are dark. The wind moves gently through the grass. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the first light of another morning is beginning to gather. The same sun that rose over Sparta more than 2,000 years ago will rise again. Not for Leonidas. Not for Xerxes. Not for the 300. For us. And for everyone who comes after. The ancient world has gone to sleep. Perhaps we should too. Slowly. Quietly. Without hurry. Because the story has been told. The king has fallen. The empire has passed. The city has faded. The monument remains. And the name, Leonidas, rests quietly in the darkness until someone remembers it again. And then, very softly, the story begins once more. What really happened at the hot gates? Before we finally let the battlefield disappear into the darkness, there is one last thing worth doing. We should return to Thermopylae itself. Not the Thermopylae of paintings. Not the Thermopylae of Hollywood. Not the Thermopylae of heroic posters and dramatic music. The real place. The real battle. The real men. Because the farther a story travels through time, the more decorations gather around it. The simplest way to understand Leonidas is therefore to strip some of those decorations away. Imagine the year 480 BCE. There is no modern Greece. There is no country called Greece in the modern sense. Instead, there are independent city-states scattered across a landscape of mountains, valleys, islands, and coastlines. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and many others. They speak related dialects. They worship many of the same gods. They share myths and traditions. But they are not one country. They fight each other. They form alliances. They break alliances. They trade. They compete. They insult one another. In other words, they behave rather like human beings. Then, from the east, comes an empire. Not an unknown empire. The Persian Empire has already confronted the Greeks. Years earlier, Persian forces had landed at Marathon. The Athenians had defeated them. That defeat did not end Persian interest in Greece. It simply postponed the problem. The Persian king Xerxes inherited the imperial ambition. He was not marching toward Greece because he had suddenly developed a personal dislike of Spartan cooking. There were strategic and political reasons. The Persian Empire wanted security. It wanted to punish those who had interfered in imperial affairs. It wanted to prevent the Greek states from becoming a continuing source of instability. And, of course, emperors tend to appreciate the idea of expanding their empire. So Xerxes prepared. The scale of the preparations was enormous. Roads, bridges, supply systems, ships, troops, animals, food, equipment. The famous bridge across the Hellespont became one of the great engineering efforts associated with the invasion. Persia was not improvising. This was an organized imperial campaign. And then came the march. The army moved through Thrace, then Macedonia, then Thessaly. The Greeks knew they were coming. They had to decide where to resist. The first obvious problem was geography. Greece is mountainous. Armies cannot simply march wherever they want. Narrow passes can become strategic barriers. The Greeks understood this. Thermopylae was one such location. The name means something like the hot gates, referring to the area's hot springs. The landscape was much narrower in antiquity than it is today. The sea came closer to the mountain slopes. The pass was constricted. That mattered enormously. A huge army could not deploy its full strength at once. The Persians could not simply surround the Greeks from every direction. Their numbers were temporarily neutralized by geography. And this is perhaps the most important military lesson of Thermopylae. The Greeks did not need to defeat the entire Persian army. They only needed to prevent it from using its entire strength. The terrain did the rest. The Greek force was commanded by Leonidas. He was one of Sparta's two kings. This dual kingship was one of the unusual features of the Spartan political system. Sparta did not have a single king. It had two royal houses, two kings, two lineages, two sets of ancestral claims. The arrangement was designed, among other things, to prevent one royal family from becoming too powerful. Whether it always worked perfectly is another question. Ancient political systems had a charming habit of producing problems they were supposedly designed to prevent. Leonidas belonged to the Aegead royal house. His fellow king, Leonidas, belonged to the other royal line. Leonidas was therefore not simply a military commander. He was a political figure. His decision to go to Thermopylae had consequences for Sparta itself. The Greeks gathered a force. It was not just 300 Spartans. This is essential. The famous 300 were a special contingent of Spartan citizens. They were accompanied by other Greek troops. Different ancient sources provide different numbers and details. Herodotus gives a detailed account. His figures must be treated carefully. Ancient armies were difficult to count. Writers had reasons to exaggerate. But the overall picture is clear. Several thousand Greek troops were initially present. The Spartans were the most famous component. They were not the entire army. That distinction matters. The 300 were selected Spartan warriors. According to tradition, Leonidas deliberately chose men who had living sons. This detail is often interpreted as practical. If a soldier died, his family line would continue. Whether every detail is historically certain is impossible to establish, but the story fits the logic of Spartan society. The state needed citizens, and the deaths of the 300 would be permanent. So perhaps the selection was not simply about choosing the strongest. It was also about choosing men whose deaths would not end their family lines. There is something quietly tragic about that. A father leaving his home, a child too young to understand, a wife watching him depart. The soldier may know he could die. The family knows too. And yet the march continues. This is one of the aspects of ancient warfare that modern images often hide. Every soldier was attached to a household. Behind every shield was a family. Behind every helmet was a face. Behind every casualty was a missing person. History records armies. Families experienced absences. The Greeks arrived. The Persians approached. And for a while, nothing happened. The Persian army camped. Xerxes may have expected the Greeks to retreat. After all, the Persian force was enormous. The Greek defenders were few. The pass could perhaps be taken through force. The king waited. The Greeks waited. The sun moved. The days passed. The Persians eventually attacked. The first assaults were unsuccessful. Then more elite troops were sent. The Immortals. This famous Persian unit has been heavily romanticized. They were an elite formation. The name, Immortals, may actually derive from a term suggesting that the unit was constantly maintained at a fixed strength. When one man died, another replaced him. To an observer, the number therefore seemed never to change. Immortal. A poetic name. But these were human soldiers. They bled. They fell. They could not magically return to life. The Immortals attacked. The Greeks held. Their heavy armor and shields were suited to the narrow battlefield. The Persian infantry could not easily exploit its numerical advantage. The Greek hoplite formation was designed for close combat. The large round shield protected much of the body. The spear gave reach. The helmet and armor provided additional protection. But the real advantage was formation. A hoplite was dangerous not because he was an individual superhero. He was dangerous because he was part of a wall. Shield beside shield. Man beside man. If the formation remained intact, an enemy had to break through a collective structure. This was difficult in a narrow pass. The Spartans were experienced at maintaining such discipline. The Persian soldiers attacked. The Greeks pushed back. The battle continued. And Xerxes watched. Imagine the frustration. The empire had crossed enormous distances. The king had assembled an army of immense scale. And now a comparatively small group was standing in a narrow mountain pass and refusing to move. This was not supposed to happen. But war is full of things that are not supposed to happen. Then came the betrayal. A Greek named Ephialtes approached the Persians. He revealed the existence of a mountain path that could lead around the Greek position. The path was not necessarily a secret to everyone. Local people knew it. But the Persians needed guidance. Ephialtes provided it. The Persian troops moved at night. The Greek defenders did not immediately realize what was happening. The mountain path allowed the Persians to outflank the main position. Now the Greeks faced a terrible choice. Stay or withdraw. Leonidas learned that the position was compromised. The strategic situation had changed. The pass was no longer secure. The Greek army could be surrounded. A withdrawal became necessary. And this is where the story becomes especially interesting. Because Leonidas did not simply order everyone to stay. Many of the Greek forces withdrew. This was not cowardice. It was strategy. If the Greeks could survive, they could fight elsewhere. Thermopylae was lost. The larger war was not. Leonidas stayed with the remaining force. The Spartans stayed. The Thespians stayed. Some Thebans remained under circumstances that were more complicated. The final defense began. And now the battle became what history remembers. The Greeks moved forward. No longer simply defending the narrowest point. They attacked. They fought. They killed. They were surrounded. The Persian army pressed from the front. The flanking force approached from behind. The defenders were trapped. At some point, Leonidas was killed. The exact details are uncertain. Ancient accounts tell of fierce fighting around his body. The Spartans and their allies attempted to recover it. The Persian forces fought to prevent them. This struggle became part of the legend. The king's body became a symbol. The fight over it demonstrated how important he was to his men. Eventually, the Greeks were overwhelmed. The last defenders were killed. Thermopylae was open. The Persian army advanced. That is the historical core. Everything else grows around it. And perhaps the core is enough. The battle was not a victory. It was a delaying action. But it was a delaying action of extraordinary intensity. And the timing mattered. The Greek coalition was still forming. The naval forces were still active. The Persian advance had not yet become unstoppable. The battle gave the Greeks time. Not enough to prevent Athens from being occupied, but enough to contribute to the larger resistance. Then came Salamis. The Persian navy was defeated. Xerxes withdrew. Then came Plataea. Mardonius's army was defeated. The invasion collapsed. The Persian Empire remained powerful, but it would not conquer mainland Greece. Leonidas's final stand therefore became connected to the survival of the Greek coalition. That connection was powerful. The story became symbolic. And symbols have long lives. But there is something else worth remembering. Leonidas did not know how the war would end. He did not die knowing that Salamis would be won. He did not know Plataea would happen. He did not know Persia would withdraw. He did not know that his name would survive. He only knew the immediate situation. The enemy was coming. The position was compromised. The order to retreat had been given, and he decided to stay. This is perhaps the most human part of the story. We often admire historical figures because we know the ending. Leonidas did not. For him, the future was darkness. That makes his decision more meaningful. He acted without certainty. That is what courage often is. Not the absence of fear, the absence of certainty. You do not know what happens next. You act anyway. And perhaps the ancient Spartans understood this better than most. Their entire culture was built around preparing people for uncertainty. War could not be made safe. Death could not be eliminated. Fear could not be abolished. But behavior could be trained. You could teach someone what to do while afraid. That may be the real lesson of Spartan discipline. Not that fear disappears, but that action does not always have to follow fear. A soldier can be afraid and remain. A parent can be afraid and protect a child. A sailor can be afraid and keep working during a storm. A person can be afraid and still do what seems necessary. The emotion remains. The behavior changes. Leonidas's legend often removes the fear, but perhaps fear was present. We simply cannot see it. And perhaps that makes him more human. Now imagine the final evening. The light is fading. The mountains are becoming dark. The campfires flicker. The Greek soldiers know what is coming. There is no longer much room for illusion. Tomorrow will be different. There is no escape route. No cavalry coming over the ridge. No sudden miracle. No hidden army. Only the enemy. Some men may speak quietly. Some may sharpen weapons. Some may pray. Some may sit silently. Some may think about home. Some may joke. Soldiers often joke before terrible events. It is one of humanity's strangest coping mechanisms. If you cannot control death, you can at least make a joke before it arrives. Somewhere among these men is Leonidas. Perhaps he speaks with his officers. Perhaps he walks among the soldiers. Perhaps he is quiet. We do not know. Herodotus gives us fragments. Later writers add stories. But the actual private moment is lost. And perhaps that is better. We can leave it private. There are things history does not need to invent. The night passes. Morning comes. The battle begins. And then the story moves beyond history into memory. Leonidas falls. The 300 fall. The Thespians fall. The Persians win the pass. And yet the battle does not end there. It continues in the minds of people. That is where Leonidas truly becomes immortal. Not on the battlefield. In memory. The body dies. The story survives. The story changes. The story becomes larger. The story becomes simpler. And eventually, people forget that the simplicity is artificial. They remember 300. They forget the thousands who stood with them. They remember Sparta. They forget Thespiae. They remember Leonidas. They forget the countless unnamed soldiers. But perhaps tonight we can remember all of them. The 300. The 700 Thespians. The other Greek defenders. The Persian soldiers. The families waiting at home. The civilians caught in the invasion. The people of Athens who watched their city burn. The sailors at Salamis. The soldiers at Plataea. The messengers. The cooks. The slaves. The farmers. The children. All the people who lived through a war that later generations would reduce to a few famous names. That is what history often does. It compresses. Life expands. History compresses. A person lives 70 years. A textbook gives them 2 paragraphs. A battle lasts days. A documentary gives it 20 minutes. A civilization lasts centuries. A museum gives it 1 room. The compression is necessary. But we should never mistake the summary for the experience. Leonidas's life was not a movie. It was decades. There were ordinary days. There were boring meetings. There were family arguments. There were meals. There were religious ceremonies. There were political disputes. There were harvests. There were injuries. There were illnesses. There were moments when nothing happened. And then, suddenly, everything happened. That is what makes a human life. Long stretches of ordinary time. A few moments of extraordinary importance. Leonidas's final moments became famous. His ordinary moments disappeared. Perhaps that is unfair. But it is inevitable. History remembers the dramatic. It forgets the quiet. Tonight, however, we can give some of the quiet back. Imagine Leonidas before the Persian invasion. Imagine him walking through Sparta. The city is not a giant military fortress. It is a settlement in the Eurotas Valley. Mountains surround it. The river runs nearby. There are farms, fields, houses, sanctuaries, public spaces. The air is warm. Dust rises from roads. People know one another. Sparta is not enormous. Its power comes from the system, the discipline, the social structure, the land, the military tradition, and the fear that holds much of it together. Because the Spartan citizen class is a minority, the Hellenic population is much larger. The entire system depends on controlling them. This is a fact that modern heroic depictions often avoid. Spartan military freedom was partly built on the labor of people who did not possess that freedom. The warriors could train because someone else worked the land. The citizens could gather for meals because others produced the food. The soldiers could leave for war because someone remained behind to maintain the economy. This does not erase Spartan courage, but it complicates the picture. And complexity is exactly what history deserves. The story becomes more interesting when the world is allowed to be morally uncomfortable. Sparta was admired for discipline. It was also deeply unequal. It valued freedom for citizens. It depended on unfree labor. It celebrated courage. It could be ruthless. It produced remarkable soldiers. It created extraordinary suffering. These contradictions are not exceptions. They are the normal condition of human societies. Athens was democratic for citizens. It also practiced slavery. Persia governed diverse peoples. It also conquered territories. Rome built roads and laws. It also conquered enormous populations. History is not a competition to find a society with no flaws. There was no such society. Leonidas existed within this imperfect world. He did not stand outside it. He was its product. And yet he could still perform an act that later generations found meaningful. That is another useful lesson. People are more complicated than the societies that produce them. A person can belong to an imperfect system and still display courage. A person can belong to a heroic tradition and still possess flaws. The past should not be reduced to heroes and villains. It should be populated by people. That is how we can finally see Leonidas. Not as a statue. As a person. A person born into a particular place. A person trained according to a particular system. A person given power. A person given responsibility. A person who made choices. And eventually, a person who died. That is enough. The rest is history. And now, as we approach the final quiet hours of this story, perhaps it is worth returning to the famous number, 300. Why has that number become so powerful? Because numbers are easier to remember than names. 300. It sounds precise. It sounds complete. It creates an image. 300 against an empire. But behind the number were individuals. 300 faces. 300 voices. 300 families. 300 different lives. Some were probably confident. Some anxious. Some angry. Some tired. Some religious. Some skeptical. Some young. Some older. They were not identical. They were not a single personality. They were men. The number erased their differences. History turned them into one object. The 300. And perhaps that is both beautiful and sad. They became united forever. But in becoming a symbol, they lost some individuality. We know almost none of their names. Leonidas is remembered. Most of the 300 are not. Their families knew them. Their children knew them. Their friends knew them. But history did not. That is the fate of most people. You can live a full life and still disappear from history. And that is not necessarily tragic. Most lives are not supposed to become monuments. Most lives are lived for the people nearby. For a family. For a village. For a friend. For a small circle. That is enough. The idea that everyone needs to become famous is a very modern obsession. The ancient world did not promise that. Leonidas became famous accidentally. The men beside him became famous collectively. Most of the people around them disappeared. And still, their lives mattered. They mattered because they were lived. That may be the quietest lesson in the entire story. A life does not need to be remembered to have meaning. It only needs to have been lived. The sun rises. The sun sets. People come. People go. Kingdoms appear. Kingdoms vanish. And somehow the world continues. The same mountains that watch Leonidas now watch highways. The same valley that once carried armies now carries modern life. The same springs still bubble from the earth. Water is strangely patient. It does not care about empires. It flows. The mountains do not salute heroes. They stand. The sea does not remember battles. It moves. Only humans remember. And perhaps memory is our way of refusing to let everything disappear at once. We tell stories because the past is gone. We tell stories because people are gone. We tell stories because we want to hold something for a little longer. Leonidas is one of those things. A fragment of humanity held inside a story. A man who lived more than 2,000 years ago. A king whose world vanished. A soldier whose final decision became legendary. And now, as the story begins to fade, we can finally leave him. Not with a battle cry. Not with a triumphant speech. Not with the image of an army charging. But with a quiet mourning. The battlefield is empty. The weapons are gone. The dead have been buried. The empire has moved on. The Greeks are preparing for the next battle. The families are waiting. And the mountains are still there. The wind moves through the pass. A bird calls somewhere in the distance. Water runs over stone. The sun rises slowly. For a moment, nothing happens. And in that silence, history feels very far away. Then we remember. Leonidas. The 300. Thermopylae. The Hot Gates. A story about courage. A story about duty. A story about sacrifice. A story about how defeat can sometimes become more memorable than victory. And perhaps most of all, a story about how one human life can become larger than itself. Not because the person was immortal, but because someone remembered. And someone else remembered after them. And someone else again. Until centuries became millennia. Until the ancient road became a modern road. Until the old battlefield became a quiet place beneath the sky. Until the name Leonidas became something more than a name. A symbol. A question. A memory. And now, perhaps, it is time to let the question rest. The night is deep. The ancient world is quiet. The fires have gone out. The shields are silent. The soldiers are gone. The king is gone. The empire is gone. Only the story remains. And even the story, eventually, will grow quiet. So let it. Let the mountains fade. Let the hot gates disappear into darkness. Let the old Greek voices become distant. Let the Persian army become a shadow. Let the stars remain overhead. And somewhere in that ancient silence, let Leonidas finally rest. Not as a perfect hero, not as a myth, but as a man. A mortal man who stood for a moment in a place where history happened to be watching. And then history remembered. Slowly. Quietly. For thousands of years. Until tonight. And now, the story is quiet again. The mountains are dark. The wind is soft. The water keeps moving. And the ancient world sleeps. Perhaps we should too. Good night.